I went to pick up my husband after work to surprise him for our 7th anniversary. When the elevator doors opened at his financial firm, I did not find the exhausted, hard-working man. I thought I married. I found his hands tangled in another woman. But the most terrifying part was not the betrayal itself. It was the dead, calculating smirk on his face when he opened his eyes and looked right at me. He did not panic. What happened next forced me to burn his entire kingdom to the ground. My name is Sarah. I am 31 years old. I stood in the immaculate marble lobby of Vanguard Financial with a velvet box in my hands. Inside the box was a vintage Rolex completely restored. It took me 6 months to track down that specific model because David had mentioned it on our first date. I gave up my own career as a forensic accountant to manage his grueling schedule and our exhausting fertility treatments. I thought I was being the perfect supportive wife. I thought this surprise would remind him of how far we had come. Instead, my entire reality shattered the moment my leather heels touched the polished floor. The executive floor was mostly empty since it was past 7 in the evening. The only sound was the soft hum of the central air conditioning and a muffled giggle coming from the glass-walled corridor. I turned the corner toward his corner office. David was there. He had Jessica, his 25-year-old junior associate, pressed against the frosted glass of the main conference room. His hands were gripping her waist. Her arms were wrapped tightly around his neck. It was not a brief, accidental moment of weakness. It was aggressive, familiar, and deeply intimate. My breath caught in my throat. My feet cemented to the floor. The velvet box suddenly felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. I expected my heart to break. I expected to drop the gift and scream. But before the shock could even fully register in my brain, the situation mutated into a nightmare. David opened his eyes. He was still kissing her, but his gaze shifted over her shoulder and locked directly onto mine. Any normal man caught cheating by his wife would shove the mistress away. He would stammer. He would beg. He would show at least a fraction of human guilt. David did none of those things. The corners of his mouth curled upward. He actually smirked at me. He slowly pulled back from Jessica. He did not look startled. He looked amused. He leaned down and whispered something quietly into her ear. Jessica let out a soft, breathy laugh. She turned her head, looked me up and down with absolute contempt, and then casually smoothed her wrinkled silk blouse. She picked up her designer purse from a nearby desk and walked past me without a single word. The scent of her cheap vanilla perfume hit my face like a physical slap. I stood frozen. I could not comprehend the sheer audacity of what I had just witnessed. David adjusted his expensive silk tie. He casually buttoned his suit jacket and walked slowly toward me. His footsteps echoed off the marble floor. There was no apology in his eyes. There was only a cold, predatory calculation. He stopped right in front of me. He looked at the velvet box in my hands and sighed heavily. "What are you doing here, Sarah?" he asked. His tone was not defensive. It was drenched in pity. I opened my mouth to speak, but the words choked in my throat. "You were kissing her," I finally managed to whisper. My voice was trembling, betraying the hurricane of emotions tearing through my chest. David rolled his eyes. He let out a loud, exaggerated groan, making sure his voice carried down the hallway, where a few late-working analysts were still sitting at their desks. "Not this again, Sarah," he said loudly. "Are you having another one of your paranoid episodes?" I stared at him in pure disbelief. "What are you talking about?" I asked. "I just saw you with my own 2 eyes. You had her pinned against the glass." David shook his head and placed a firm, heavy hand on my shoulder. His grip was tight enough to bruise. He looked at the junior analysts down the hall, offering them an apologetic, embarrassed smile, completely humiliating me in front of his staff. Jessica was crying because she just found out her father's cancer returned. David projected his voice smoothly, playing the role of the patient. Long-suffering husband. She was having a panic attack in the hallway. I was comforting her. "You are hallucinating again, Sarah. We talked about this. The hormone injections from the fertility treatments are completely wrecking your emotional stability. You are not thinking clearly." He was gaslighting me. He was doing it flawlessly, right in the middle of his office. He was using the grueling medical treatments I endured for our family as a weapon to make me look completely insane. I tried to pull my shoulder away from his grip. "Do not touch me," I said, my voice rising. "I know exactly what I saw, David. His smile vanished. His eyes went completely dead. The mask slipped just for a fraction of a second, revealing the monster hiding underneath. "You are going to stop embarrassing me right now," he hissed quietly, his voice dropping so only I could hear it. "You're going to turn around, walk to the elevator, and keep your mouth shut. If you make a scene, I will call the clinic and tell them you are having a mental breakdown." Before I could even process the threat, the mask was back on. "Come on, sweetheart," David said loudly, returning to his fake, gentle tone. "Let us get you home. You need your medication. You are exhausting yourself." He wrapped his arm around my waist, trapping me against his side. The pressure he applied was intense physically, forcing me to move backward toward the elevator bank. My mind was spinning violently. The man I had loved and supported for half a decade felt like a complete stranger. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to fight back, to scream the truth to the entire office. But a tiny, rational voice in the back of my head told me to stop. If I fought him now here on his territory, I would just look like the crazy, hysterical wife he was claiming I was. He had already laid the groundwork. He had planted the seed of my instability. The elevator door slid open. He shoved me inside and hit the button for the underground parking garage. The ride down was suffocatingly silent. I stared at the metal doors, clutching the velvet box so tightly my knuckles turned white. When the doors opened, he marched me directly to his sleek black Tesla. He opened the passenger door, practically pushing me into the leather seat, and slammed the door shut behind me. I sat there in the dark, the scent of his cologne mixing with the lingering ghost of Jessica's vanilla perfume. I realized in that exact moment that this was not just an affair. This was a psychological war, and my husband was already steps ahead of me. The doors of the Tesla locked automatically as David pulled out of the underground parking garage. The silence inside the car was suffocating. The only sound was the soft electric hum of the engine and the rhythmic tapping of his expensive leather shoes against the floorboard. He drove with one hand casually draped over the steering wheel, looking completely relaxed, as if he had not just been caught physically wrapped around his 25-year-old subordinate. I sat rigid in the passenger seat. My hands were still gripping the velvet box containing his anniversary gift. My chest felt tight, constricted by a sickening mix of adrenaline and profound betrayal. David sighed deeply. It was a practiced theatrical sigh designed to make me feel like a burden. "Sarah, you really crossed a line today," he said quietly. His voice was smooth and dangerously calm. "Do you have any idea how much damage you could have done to my reputation up there? You completely humiliated yourself in front of my junior staff." I turned my head to look at him. My vision was blurring with unshed tears, but I forced them back. "I saw you," I said, my voice barely a whisper, but laced with a hardening edge. "I saw exactly where your hands were. I saw her kissing you." David shook his head slowly, keeping his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "You saw an exhausted managing partner trying to prevent a hysterical junior associate from collapsing in the hallway." He replied without missing a beat. "You took a situation that had absolutely nothing to do with you, and your paranoid brain twisted it into a sick fantasy. He was doing it again. He was rewriting reality right in front of me, layer by layer." "Look at yourself, Sarah," he continued, his tone dripping with condescending pity. "You are trembling. Your skin is pale. You are barely sleeping. Dr. Evans warned us that this third round of IVF was going to take a massive toll on your mental stability. The hormone injections are flooding your system. They are making you erratic, delusional, and completely unpredictable." Every word he spoke felt like a calculated strike against my sanity. 3 years ago, I was a senior forensic accountant at a top firm. I spent my days dissecting complex offshore tax evasion schemes and tracking millions of dollars hidden by corrupt executives. My mind was my greatest weapon. It was sharp, precise, and ruthless. But I walked away from all of it. I gave up my partnership track to manage David's chaotic life as he built his financial firm. I gave up my body to endure grueling, agonizing fertility treatments because he desperately wanted an heir. I had spent the last 36 months injecting myself with synthetic hormones, suffering through crippling nausea and chronic fatigue, all to give him the family he demanded. And now he was using that exact sacrifice as a weapon to convince me I was losing my mind. "You need to take a step back and realize what you are doing to our marriage," David said smoothly, merging onto the highway. "You are letting these chemical imbalances destroy your trust in me. I am out here working 80-hour weeks to secure our future, and you are hunting for ghosts. You need to up your dosage of the anti-anxiety medication. I will call Dr. Evans tomorrow and have him adjust your prescription. You are becoming a liability. I dug my fingernails into my palms until the skin nearly broke. A liability. That is what I was to him now. Not a partner, not a wife. A liability that needed to be heavily medicated and kept quietly out of sight. I stared out the window at the passing streetlights. I realized arguing with him was completely useless. He had built an impenetrable wall of gaslighting, and he was fully prepared to use my medical history to destroy my credibility if I dared to speak out. I swallowed the bitter taste of bile in my throat and forced myself to remain completely silent. He took my silence as submission. A smug, satisfied smile crept back onto his face. He reached over and patted my knee condescendingly. "Good girl," he murmured. "Just rest. Let the professionals handle the stress." We pulled into the long, sweeping driveway of our suburban estate. The house was completely dark, a sprawling and empty monument to the life I had sacrificed everything to build. David put the car in park but left the engine running. He did not unbuckle his seatbelt. "Go inside and get some sleep, Sarah," he instructed, checking his luxury watch. "I have to head back downtown. The European markets are opening soon, and after that little stunt you pulled, I have a crisis meeting with the board to do damage control. I will probably have to sleep at the office tonight. Do not wait up for me." I knew it was a lie. There was no crisis meeting. He was going straight back to Jessica. He was probably going to take her to a 5-star hotel to apologize for the interruption. But I did not scream. I did not throw the velvet box at his face. The naive, desperate woman who had stepped onto his executive floor an hour ago was dead. I unbuckled my seatbelt, opened the car door, and stepped out into the cold night air without saying a single word. I closed the door quietly and walked up the front steps of the house. I heard the tires of his Tesla screech against the pavement as he reversed aggressively and sped away down the quiet, tree-lined street. I stood alone on the dark porch. The silence of the night washed over me. I unlocked the front door, stepped into the foyer, and dropped my purse onto the entryway table. The velvet box holding the vintage Rolex slipped from my fingers and hit the hardwood floor with a dull thud. I did not care. I felt completely hollowed out. But as I reached to turn on the hallway light, my phone vibrated violently in my coat pocket. Then it vibrated again. I pulled it out and looked at the glowing screen. It was an automated push notification from my Master Cloud storage account. The notification read, "Syncing audio and video files from device named David's Tesla Model S." My heart stopped beating for a fraction of a second. My forensic accounting background had always made me obsessive about data security. 3 years ago, when we bought that car, David had complained about the complicated setup process. I had linked the vehicle's internal operating system, including the cabin camera and the built-in microphone array, directly to my own encrypted master server for insurance purposes. It was a simple security measure that ran quietly in the background. David is not a tech guy. He had completely forgotten it existed, but I had not. My fingers trembled slightly as I unlocked my phone and opened the cloud dashboard. I tapped on the live sync folder. A progress bar flashed across the screen, followed by a live audio feed transmitting directly from the interior of his vehicle. I raised the phone to my ear. I expected to hear the radio. I expected to hear the hum of the road. Instead, I heard the crisp, clear sound of a phone ringing through the car's Bluetooth speakers. It rang twice before someone picked up. It was a woman. Jessica. "Hello, baby." Her voice purred through the speakers, laced with a sickly sweet satisfaction. "Did you drop the crazy lady back at the asylum?" A sharp, terrifying chill ripped down my spine. I stood frozen in the dark foyer, gripping my phone as my husband's voice filled my ear, laughing cruelly. I sank slowly onto the cold hardwood floor of the dimly lit foyer. The plush rug beneath me offered absolutely no comfort, as the chilling reality of my husband's voice echoed loudly through the tiny speaker of my phone. I pressed the device tightly against my ear. My breathing was shallow and uneven. I genuinely expected to hear whispered apologies to his mistress, or perhaps angry complaints about my sudden appearance at his office. What I actually heard was a conversation so utterly vile that it completely froze the blood in my veins. Yes, baby. I dropped the crazy lady back at the asylum. David's voice was thick with amusement. The low rumble of the car engine hummed steadily in the background. I heard Jessica let out a sharp and malicious laugh. Did you see her pathetic face? She looked like a kicked dog standing there with that stupid little velvet box. I swear, David, I almost burst out laughing right in front of her. She's so weak. She's completely clueless, David replied. His tone was dismissive and incredibly cruel. I had her apologizing to the wall by the time we reached the parking garage. The hormone excuse works like an absolute charm. She actually believes her own mind is turning against her. Dr. Evans really earned his bonus this month. The higher the dosage goes, the easier she is to manage. A violent shiver racked my body. My own husband and his 25-year-old subordinate were treating my agonizing medical struggles as a hilarious inside joke. They were actively weaponizing my physical pain, but the sick knot forming in my stomach was about to twist even tighter. The conversation shifted quickly from their arrogant mockery to something far more calculated and incredibly dangerous. So are we still on track for Friday? Jessica asked. Her voice dropped an octave, losing the breathy giggle and replacing it with a sharp, greedy edge. Because I cannot keep pretending to be a junior associate much longer. I want my corner office, and I want her gone forever. Relax, David said smoothly. Everything is perfectly aligned. I am finalizing the legal paperwork tomorrow morning before the partners arrive. What paperwork? I thought desperately. My mind raced through our joint accounts, our shared investments, and our mortgage. But nothing could have prepared me for the words that came out of his mouth next. The power of attorney clears the final legal hurdle on Thursday. David continued confidently over the Bluetooth speaker. With her documented history of declining mental competence and the psychiatric evaluations I paid Evans to doctor, no judge will ever question my authority over her assets. By Friday afternoon, I will liquidate the entirety of her late father's family trust. It is $8 million sitting in a blind account, and she's too drugged up on fertility meds to even realize it is being transferred directly into our offshore holding company. The air completely vanished from my lungs. My heart, which had been hammering wildly against my ribs, suddenly stopped beating in my chest. Are you absolutely sure the signature will pass the bank inspection? Jessica pressed. Her greed was palpable even through the digital audio feed. The bank is usually so strict with those old money trust funds. I forged it myself last night while she was passed out on the couch. David boasted proudly. It is completely flawless. Once the funds clear, we announced the hostile takeover of Vanguard Financial using her father's money as our capital. When she finally wakes up from her little pharmaceutical haze, she will be completely broke and legally declared incompetent by the state. We will have the firm, the money, and the house. She will be locked in a psychiatric ward, wearing a paper gown, and wondering where it all went wrong. Jessica sighed contentedly into the receiver. You are a genius, David. I love you so much. I love you too, baby. David replied warmly. Have a bottle of champagne waiting on ice at the hotel. We are celebrating tonight. The audio feed clicked silently as the phone call disconnected, leaving nothing but the ambient hum of the tires against the asphalt. I sat alone on the floor of my dark, empty house. The silence surrounding me was absolute and heavy. For a long moment, I did not move a single muscle. I did not blink. The tears that had been threatening to spill from my eyes completely evaporated. The paralyzing grief of a betrayed wife was instantly incinerated by the white-hot blinding fury of a woman who was about to be destroyed. This was not a simple affair. David was not just cheating on me with a younger woman. He was executing a meticulously planned financial and psychological assassination. He had bribed a medical professional to poison me with heavy sedatives disguised as fertility treatments. He was forging my signature to steal the legacy my father had literally worked himself into an early grave to build. He was planning to lock me in a secure psychiatric facility so he could steal my $8 million trust fund to finance his own corporate ambitions with his young mistress. I looked down at my hands. They were no longer trembling. The weakness, the fatigue, the crushing self-doubt that had plagued me for months vanished into thin air like smoke. David had made a massive and fatal miscalculation. He had fundamentally underestimated the woman he married. He looked at me and saw a gullible, desperate housewife who was easily manipulated. He had completely forgotten that before I ever put on a diamond wedding ring, I was one of the most ruthless forensic accountants on the eastern seaboard. I spent my entire career dismantling powerful men exactly like him. I knew exactly how to trace hidden accounts. I knew exactly how to expose forged documents. I knew exactly how to destroy a fraudulent empire from the inside out. I slowly stood up from the cold hardwood floor. My posture was perfectly straight and rigid. The terrified, naive wife who had walked into Vanguard Financial an hour ago was dead and buried forever. In her place, a cold, calculating tactician had fully awakened. I walked over to the entryway table and picked up my phone. I stared at my dark reflection in the hallway mirror and took a very deep breath. I had exactly 4 days to dismantle my husband's entire life before he stole mine. I was going to make him pay for every single lie. The game was on. I pushed myself up from the cold hardwood floor. My knees cracked slightly in the silent foyer, but I did not feel any physical pain. I walked into the downstairs bathroom and flipped on the harsh fluorescent vanity lights. The woman staring back at me in the mirror looked exactly like the fragile, broken victim David wanted her to be. My skin was pale and sickly. My eyes were red and swollen from crying. I turned on the cold water tap and splashed the freezing water heavily over my face. I watched the expensive foundation and ruined mascara wash down the porcelain drain. With a rough cotton towel, I scrubbed my skin until it was flushed and entirely awake. I was completely done crying. I walked out of the bathroom and moved silently through the dark, sprawling corridors of our luxurious suburban house. David thought this massive house was his undisputed castle. He genuinely thought he was the untouchable king who could banish me to a locked, padded cell and rule over my stolen fortune with his young subordinate. He was dead wrong. I walked past the grand staircase and opened the heavy oak door to the guest bedroom situated at the far end of the hallway. It was a dusty room I had not stepped foot inside for nearly 3 years. I walked into the walk-in closet and pushed against a false wooden wall panel. Behind it was a reinforced steel door. I entered a complex 6-digit keypad combination. The heavy internal deadbolts clicked open with a satisfying mechanical thud. This was my old home office. It was a completely soundproof, secure bunker where I used to track international money laundering rings and digitally dismantle corrupt corporate billionaires. The air inside was incredibly stale, but the high-end equipment was still sitting there patiently waiting for my return. I pulled the heavy canvas dust covers off my massive triple monitor setup. I reached under the thick mahogany desk and flipped the main power breaker for my dormant encrypted servers. The customized machines roared to life instantly with a deep, powerful mechanical hum that vibrated up through the soles of my feet. The glowing blue LED lights cast long, sharp shadows across the windowless walls. I sat down in my worn leather ergonomic chair and placed my hands gently on the mechanical keyboard. The familiar, crisp clicking sound of the keys beneath my fingertips felt like a massive shot of pure adrenaline injected straight into my veins. I bypassed our standard residential internet provider and connected my system directly to my private encrypted offshore network. My mind was suddenly crystal clear. The heavy, suffocating brain fog caused by the synthetic hormones David had been forcing into my body was completely gone. The survival instinct had burned it all away. I pulled up a digital calendar on the center monitor and stared blankly at the glowing dates. Today was Monday night. David specifically said he was filing the forged power of attorney documents on Thursday morning to clear the final legal hurdle. He explicitly planned to completely liquidate my late father's $8 million family trust by Friday afternoon. That meant I had exactly 4 days. I had exactly 96 hours to completely and utterly dismantle the entire life of a man I had spent the last 5 years blindly loving. I had 96 hours to secure my personal assets, gather irrefutable digital proof of his medical sabotage, and burn his arrogant corporate ambitions straight to the ground. I started pulling up his public financial records and running preliminary background traces on Vanguard Financial. But as the encrypted data flooded my bright screens, I immediately realized a massive logistical problem. I could track his hidden offshore accounts and secretly clone his digital footprint all by myself. I was a master at complex forensic accounting, but I could not physically file legal injunctions or quietly freeze banking assets without instantly alerting him. David was a highly paranoid and deeply connected man. He had paid informants and eyes everywhere in the local banking sector. If I walked into a corporate law firm tomorrow morning or tried to move my trust fund independently, his automated financial alerts would trigger within seconds. He would know immediately that I was onto his plot. Worse, he would instantly execute his aggressive backup plan. He already possessed the forged psychiatric evaluations from his corrupt private doctor. If he saw me making a defensive legal move, he would just call the authorities and have me forcibly committed to a secure psychiatric ward before noon. I needed an absolute legal shark. I needed a brilliant proxy who could quietly move mountains in the shadows while I stayed trapped in the house and flawlessly played the role of the heavily medicated, delusional wife. I needed someone absolutely ruthless, who deeply understood high-stakes corporate litigation and who absolutely despised my husband with every fiber of their being. There was only one person on the entire planet who fit that exact specific description. I picked up my cell phone and opened my contacts list. I scrolled past the endless lists of fake friends and superficial country club wives David had aggressively forced me to socialize with over the years. I stopped abruptly on a name I had not dialed in over 12 months. Maya. Maya was my older brother's wife. She was a brilliant, no-nonsense African-American corporate litigator who worked as a senior partner for one of the most aggressive and feared law firms in the city of Chicago. From the very first day she ever met David, she saw right through his charming, polished facade. She told my brother privately that David had the dead, empty eyes of an apex predator. David absolutely hated her because he could never intimidate or control her. Over the years, he had systematically and cruelly isolated me from my family, fully convincing me that Maya was secretly jealous of our financial success. I had been foolish enough to believe his lies and let those vital family relationships wither and die. But tonight, I desperately needed her fire. I needed her unmatched legal brilliance. I tapped her name and pressed the phone tightly to my ear. It was well past midnight. The phone rang 3 agonizing times before she finally picked up. Her voice was thick and heavy with sleep, but became immediately guarded the second she saw my caller identification on her screen. "Sarah," she asked, her tone laced with confusion. "Is everything all right?" "It is incredibly late." I took a very deep, steadying breath. The bright monitors illuminated my face in a cold, pale blue glow. "Maya," I said, my voice completely steady and stripped of all previous emotion. "I desperately need your help. David is actively trying to steal my late father's trust fund and legally commit me to a locked psychiatric hospital. I have the undeniable proof, and I have exactly 4 days to destroy him. Will you help me?" There was a brief, heavy silence on the other end of the line. Then I heard the sharp sound of rustling bedsheets as Maya immediately sat up. "Send me your exact location," she said, her voice now razor-sharp and completely awake. "I am on my way." I left my house at 2 in the morning, driving my old sedan, because the luxury SUV David bought me had a GPS tracker installed. I drove 30 miles to an all-night diner. Maya picked the location. It was a cash-only establishment surrounded by concrete where cell phone towers failed to reach. It was an absolute digital dead zone. This was essential. If David checked my phone location, the signal would simply bounce off the last tower near our suburban neighborhood, making it look like my phone was turned off on my nightstand. The diner smelled like stale coffee and old frying oil. I sat in the darkest corner, facing the door, running entirely on adrenaline. A sleek black town car pulled into the gravel lot. A tall figure stepped out into the freezing night air. It was Maya. She wore a tailored charcoal wool coat over her silk pajamas. She looked like she was walking into a federal courtroom. Maya is a senior partner at one of the most ruthless corporate litigation firms in Chicago. She's a brilliant African-American woman who fought her way to the top by being smarter, colder, and more prepared than anyone else in the room. David was terrified of her. That is why he spent the last 3 years manipulating me into cutting her out of my life. He convinced me she was jealous of our wealth, and I was foolish enough to believe him. The diner bell chimed loudly as she walked in. She locked eyes with me instantly. She did not look angry about the late hour. She looked ready for war. She slid into the vinyl booth across from me and placed a heavy leather briefcase on the sticky table. We did not hug. There was no time for tearful apologies. I knew I had deeply wronged her by letting David isolate me from my brother and her, but Maya was a pure pragmatist. She knew the apologies could wait until the blood was washed off the floor. She unbuttoned her wool coat and looked closely at my face. "You look like hell, Sarah," she said. Her voice was low and steady, carrying intense authority. "I feel like hell," I replied, keeping my voice completely steady. "David has been poisoning me with heavy sedatives disguised as my fertility hormone injections. He is manufacturing a narrative that I am losing my mind." Maya did not gasp. Her dark eyes simply narrowed into two dangerous slits. "I always knew that man was a snake," she murmured, resting her hands on the table. "But poisoning his own wife to steal a family trust fund is a completely new level of sociopathic behavior. Show me what you have." I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out a secure encrypted flash drive. I slid it across the table. Maya plugged it into a heavily modified tablet she pulled from her briefcase. The screen illuminated her face in a pale blue glow. I watched her read the transcribed audio files from David's car. I watched her read the financial logs proving his embezzlement and his text messages with Jessica. For 10 solid minutes, the rapid tapping of Maya's manicured fingernails against the glass screen of her tablet filled the air. Her expression remained completely unreadable, but the tension radiating from her body was palpable. When she finally reached the end of the digital transcript, she set the tablet down and slowly took a deep breath. "He is not just greedy, Sarah," she said softly. "He is highly organized and incredibly dangerous. The forged power of attorney is a massive federal crime, but it is only half of his actual weapon. If he tries to liquidate an $8 million trust, the bank will mandate a secondary verification process. They will insist on speaking to you directly to confirm the massive transfer of wealth." I nodded slowly. "That is why he needs me declared legally incompetent," I said. "If I am institutionalized, my voice is legally silenced, and the power of attorney becomes absolute." Maya picked up her tablet again. "Let us see exactly how far ahead he is," she said. Her fingers flew across the virtual keyboard. She bypassed the public court databases and logged directly into a secure back-end portal used exclusively by senior judges and high-tier litigation firms. She began pulling sealed medical affidavits and pending probate court dockets from the county database. I sat frozen as I watched a progress bar fill on her screen. Suddenly, Maya's hands stopped moving. The color seemed to drain slightly from her face. She turned the tablet around and pushed it toward me. "Look at this," she commanded, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. I leaned forward and stared at the screen. It was a digital copy of a sworn medical affidavit stamped with the official seal of the county court. The document was dated 2 days ago. It was titled, "Emergency Petition for Involuntary Psychiatric Commitment." My eyes scanned the dense legal text. The petition claimed I was an immediate danger to myself and others suffering from severe paranoid delusions and aggressive behavioral episodes. Attached to the petition was a comprehensive psychological evaluation signed by Dr. Evans. The evaluation detailed fabricated instances of me screaming at invisible people, throwing objects, and threatening self-harm. Dr. Evans had officially diagnosed me with rapid onset drug-induced psychosis. He strongly recommended a minimum 90-day hold in a secure private psychiatric facility. David had already signed the petition as my primary caregiver and legal guardian. The document was sitting on a judge's desk, waiting for a final signature on Friday morning. My stomach violently dropped. The air in my lungs felt thick and heavy. This was not just a threat. The paperwork was already filed. David had actually purchased a medical professional to legally kidnap me. He paid Dr. Evans to fabricate a completely false medical history so he could throw me into a locked room and steal my life. Maya leaned across the table. Her eyes were burning with a cold, fierce intensity. "Do you understand what this means, Sarah?" she asked sharply. "This means you have absolutely zero margin for error. If you go home right now and scream at him if you throw his clothes on the lawn or threaten him with a divorce lawyer, he will not argue with you. He will simply dial 911. He will hand this signed petition to the police when they arrive. Because you have those sedatives in your bloodstream, you will fail every field sobriety test they give you. You will look crazy and you will sound crazy. You will be strapped to a gurney and locked in a padded room before the sun comes up. And the moment those hospital doors lock behind you, David wins everything. I stared at the sealed court document on the glowing screen. The terrifying reality of my situation crushed down on my shoulders like a ton of solid lead. I was standing on a trapdoor and my husband was holding the lever. What do I do, Maya? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. How do I stop a legal machine that is already in motion? Maya reached across the sticky table and gripped my hands tightly. Her grip was grounding and incredibly strong. We are going to build a bigger machine, she said firmly. We are going to quietly sever his financial lifelines, drain his shell companies, and expose his fraud on a massive public stage. But to do that, I need exactly 96 hours to move the assets and file the countersuits. You have to give me those 96 hours, Sarah. I swallowed hard. How? I asked. Maya looked deeply into my eyes. You have to go back to that house, she instructed. You have to walk through that front door, and you have to be the exact pathetic broken woman he expects you to be. You have to swallow your pride. You have to act exhausted, confused, and deeply medicated. You cannot challenge him. You cannot fight back. You have to let him believe he has completely broken you. It will be the hardest performance of your entire life. But if he feels even a fraction of a percent of suspicion, he will execute the psych hold immediately. I looked away from her and stared into the dark, empty parking lot. The thought of going back to that house and smiling at the man who was plotting to destroy me made me physically sick. But the forensic accountant inside me knew Maya was absolutely right. Emotion was a liability. Strategy was survival. I looked back at my sister-in-law. My expression hardened into a mask of pure ice. I will give you your 96 hours, I said. Let him think he is winning. Tuesday evening arrived with a suffocating heaviness. David had informed me that morning that he was hosting an intimate dinner party for the senior partners at Vanguard Financial. He framed it as a necessary corporate function, but I knew the actual objective. It was a calculated theatrical performance. He wanted his most influential colleagues to witness my supposed mental decline firsthand. He wanted a room full of credible witnesses to testify to my erratic behavior when the psychiatric hold was finally executed on Friday. And to twist the knife even deeper, he insisted that Jessica attend to take the meeting minutes. I spent the entire afternoon preparing a flawless 5-course meal. I roasted a rack of lamb and set the massive mahogany dining table with our wedding china. I wore a loose-fitting beige dress that made me look slightly frail. I deliberately applied my makeup to accentuate the dark circles under my eyes. When the doorbell rang at 7 o'clock, I took a deep breath and buried my forensic accountant instincts deep inside. I opened the door and welcomed his 3 senior partners. David stood right behind them, radiating a sickening artificial warmth. And right beside him was Jessica. She wore a tight crimson dress that completely violated corporate etiquette. She looked me up and down with a familiar, arrogant smirk. I forced a vacant, heavily medicated smile onto my face and took their coats. I hung David's custom-tailored suit jacket in the front hallway closet, making a very careful mental note of exactly which pocket held his primary encrypted cell phone. The dinner was absolute psychological torture. We sat around the glowing candelabra in the formal dining room. David dominated the conversation with aggressive talk about his upcoming hostile takeover of a rival firm. I sat at the head of the table, playing the perfect broken prop. When it was time to pour the expensive vintage red wine, I stood up and purposefully let my hand tremble just enough to clink the heavy glass bottle against the rim of a partner's crystal goblet. A few drops of dark red wine spilled onto the pristine white linen tablecloth. David immediately stopped talking. He looked at the spilled wine and let out a loud, dramatic sigh that silenced the entire room. "It is quite all right, Sarah," he said smoothly, using that same condescending tone from the lobby. "Why do you not sit down and let Jessica pour the rest of the wine? You have been so incredibly clumsy and fatigued lately." The partners exchanged uncomfortable, sympathetic glances with my husband. One of them actually reached out and patted David's shoulder, offering silent support for his burdensome wife. Jessica stood up eagerly and took the heavy bottle from my hands. Her fingers deliberately brushed against mine, and her cheap vanilla perfume invaded my personal space. She smiled sweetly at the partners and flawlessly poured the remaining glasses. I lowered my head and stared at my plate. I allowed a single tear to fall down my cheek, perfectly mimicking the quiet humiliation of a defeated woman. David watched me cry and took a slow, satisfied sip of his wine. He was completely convinced that his psychological warfare was working flawlessly. He thought he was watching me drown, but he did not realize I was quietly mapping the exact depth of the ocean. Halfway through the main course, I quietly excused myself from the table, complaining of a sudden migraine. David nodded sympathetically to his guests and told me to go rest my head for a few minutes. I walked slowly up the grand staircase, making sure my footsteps sounded heavy and uncoordinated. But the second I was out of their line of sight, my posture snapped perfectly straight. I walked quickly down the hall and pushed open the heavy wooden door to the master bathroom. I needed cold water to wash the sickening feeling of their smug faces from my mind. But as I approached the massive marble vanity, I stopped dead in my tracks. Sitting perfectly upright next to my expensive imported face creams was a tube of cheap bright crimson lipstick. It was the exact same shade Jessica was wearing downstairs. She had used the upstairs bathroom before dinner and intentionally left it there. It was not an accident. It was a deliberate, deeply arrogant territorial marker. She was standing in my house using my bathroom and leaving her trash on my counter to silently remind me that she was already taking over my entire life. She wanted me to find it. She wanted me to lose my mind, run downstairs and start screaming like a crazy person in front of the senior partners. It was the perfect trap to justify the psychiatric hold. A cold, dark laugh echoed silently in my chest. I did not touch the lipstick. I left it exactly where it was. I looked at myself in the mirror and felt the absolute freezing cold clarity of my purpose. I was not going to give her a screaming match. I was going to give her a federal indictment. I turned away from the bathroom and walked quickly and silently back down the carpeted stairs. I bypassed the dining room completely. I could hear the loud, confident voices of the partners and the soft clinking of silverware echoing from the other room. David was deep into a story about a recent golf tournament. I slipped like a shadow into the dark front hallway and opened the heavy coat closet. I reached into the deep pocket of my own wool trench coat and pulled out the small black rectangular device Maya had given me the night before at the diner. It was a military-grade model rapid data cloner. It was no larger than a standard portable power bank, but it possessed the capability to aggressively bypass digital encryption and mirror an entire hard drive in under 2 minutes. I reached out and gently patted the side of David's suit jacket. I felt the heavy rectangular outline of his cell phone in the inner breast pocket. I slipped my hand inside and pulled the phone out. The screen was locked and completely black. I plugged the short braided cable of the rapid cloner directly into the charging port of his device. A tiny green indicator light on the cloner instantly blinked to life. The extraction process had begun. I stood in the pitch-black closet holding my breath. My heart was hammering a dangerous, violent rhythm against my ribs. I stared at the tiny glowing digital display on the cloner. It showed a rapid progress bar and a ticking countdown timer. 90 seconds. That was exactly how long Maya said it would take to siphon the encrypted messaging app data, the hidden offshore banking tokens, and his private email archives. 80 seconds. I could hear the scraping of wooden chairs against the dining room floor. Someone was standing up. My hands remained perfectly steady, but adrenaline flooded every single vein in my body. 60 seconds. The voices in the dining room grew slightly louder. David was laughing. 50 seconds. I needed his phone because the audio recordings from the car only proved his intent. I needed the digital paper trail to prove his actual financial crimes to the federal authorities. 30 seconds. Footsteps began to echo in the hallway. Someone was walking toward the front of the house. It was David. He was loudly telling Jessica to check his coat pocket for a specific business card he wanted to give a partner. 20 seconds. The progress bar hit 90%. 10 seconds. The heavy mahogany door separating the hallway from the dining room swung open. 5 seconds. The cloner vibrated once in my palm, and the tiny screen flashed the word complete. I ripped the cable out of his phone. I shoved the cloning device deep into my dress pocket and slipped his cell phone flawlessly back into the inner breast pocket of his suit jacket. I took exactly one step back from the closet just as David and Jessica walked around the corner. David stopped abruptly when he saw me standing in the dim hallway. His eyes narrowed with instant suspicion. "What are you doing out here, Sarah?" he demanded sharply, dropping his gentle husband persona completely since the partners were still in the other room. I looked up at him with a perfectly blank, confused expression. I rubbed my temples and let out a soft, pathetic sigh. "I was just looking for my migraine medication," I whispered weakly. "I thought I left it in my purse on the console table. I am so dizzy, David." David stared at me for a long, agonizing second, trying to detect a lie. Then the suspicion faded from his eyes, replaced entirely by his usual arrogant contempt. He sneered at me and reached directly into the coat closet. He pulled his cell phone from his jacket pocket and tapped the screen, checking for messages. It was completely untouched. "Go back upstairs and go to sleep, Sarah," he ordered coldly. "You are embarrassing yourself." Jessica smirked at me and brushed past my shoulder to grab the business cards from his other pocket. I lowered my head and slowly walked up the stairs, playing the role of the defeated wife. But inside my dress pocket, my fingers curled tightly around the solid black rapid cloner. I had everything I needed to destroy his entire world. At exactly 2 in the morning, the massive house was silent. I stood silently beside the heavy oak bed frame. David was trapped in a deep sleep, completely convinced that his grand master plan was moving steadily forward. I quietly backed out of the master bedroom and made my way down the dark hallways to the hidden guest room closet. I locked the reinforced steel door of my bunker behind me and sat down at the glowing monitors. I pulled the black rapid data cloner from my pocket and connected it directly to my encrypted server. The system recognized the device and began unpacking the massive payload of stolen data. I cracked my knuckles and leaned closer to the bright screens. It was time to go back to work. For the first hour, I meticulously combed through his private messaging applications and personal emails. I quickly found the predictable filth. There were endless messages between him and Jessica discussing their future and mocking my supposed mental breakdown. There were digital receipts for expensive hotel suites and diamond jewelry he had purchased for her using his personal credit cards. But as a former senior forensic accountant, I knew that infidelity was just a distraction. The real story was always buried deep in the numbers. I opened his hidden offshore banking application and bypassed the secondary security protocol using the mirrored authentication tokens I had just stolen from his coat pocket. A massive digital ledger flooded my center monitor. The sheer volume of the financial transactions immediately triggered every single alarm bell in my professional mind. David was a managing partner at Vanguard Financial, but the numbers on my screen did not align with a standard executive compensation package. I began tracing the routing numbers hidden within the encrypted ledger. I followed the money through a complex labyrinth of digital wire transfers. He was not just preparing to steal my $8 million family trust. He had already siphoned over $20 million directly from the private retirement accounts of his firm's most elite clients. He was systematically draining their portfolios in small, untraceable increments and funneling the stolen capital through a network of international digital wallets. He was using the embezzled money to artificially inflate his own purchasing power. I opened a subfolder containing his strategy documents. The entire hostile takeover he had been bragging about at the dinner party was completely funded by this illegal embezzlement scheme. He was literally stealing from his own clients to buy a rival financial institution. But the true horror of his conspiracy did not hit me until I traced the final destination of those stolen millions. I ran a reverse lookup on the holding accounts where the embezzled funds were currently resting. The money was parked in 3 separate domestic shell companies registered in the state of Delaware. I accessed the state corporate registry database and pulled the official incorporation documents for all 3 entities. When the scant paperwork fully rendered on my bright screen, the breath violently left my lungs. My vision blurred for a fraction of a second as I stared at the ink on the digital documents. David was not listed as the owner of these shell companies. Jessica was not listed either. The sole proprietor, the chief executive officer, and the primary legal beneficiary of all 3 fraudulent corporations was me. My full legal name was printed clearly at the top of every single page. At the bottom of the incorporation documents, right next to the notary stamp, was my exact signature. It was a flawless forgery. David had painstakingly copied my handwriting to officially register the shell companies under my identity. The reality of his ultimate failsafe crashed down on me. If the Securities and Exchange Commission ever noticed the missing $20 million, they would follow the digital paper trail straight to those Delaware corporations. If the federal authorities raided Vanguard Financial and audited the ledgers, they would not arrest David. They would look at the legal documentation and they would immediately arrest me. He was framing me for a federal crime. The psychiatric hold was not just a convenient way to steal my father's trust fund. It was the ultimate legal shield for his embezzlement. If I was locked inside a mental institution, heavily medicated, and legally declared incompetent, I would never be able to defend myself in a federal court. The authorities would assume the unstable wife had stolen the money. I would be transferred directly from a psychiatric ward to a federal penitentiary. David would play the role of the devastated, innocent husband. He would keep his career, he would keep his freedom, and he would keep my family legacy while I rotted in a concrete cell for the rest of my life. I sat back in my leather chair and stared at the glowing blue screens. The sheer scale of his calculated sociopathic cruelty was entirely impossible to comprehend. He had weaponized my body with fertility hormones, he had weaponized my mind with gaslighting, and now he was actively weaponizing my legal identity to cover up his own financial felonies. A profound freezing calm washed over my entire body. The anger and the betrayal completely evaporated, leaving nothing behind but absolute ruthless calculation. This was no longer a simple domestic dispute. A quiet divorce settlement was completely off the table. Taking half of his assets and walking away would not protect me from the federal trap he had already set. The only way to save my own life and secure my freedom was to destroy his criminal enterprise before he could pull the trigger. I had to surgically drain the shell companies, I had to expose the embezzlement, and I had to deliver him directly to the federal authorities on a silver platter. I picked up my encrypted phone and dialed Maya's private number. I listened to the loud dial tone echoing in the room. It was time to initiate the absolute financial slaughter. I had already uncovered enough digital evidence to send David to a federal penitentiary for the next 20 years. The embezzlement of $20 million from his clients and the forged incorporation documents in my name were massive, undeniable felonies. I could have stopped right there. I could have handed the encrypted hard drive to Maya and let the federal authorities tear his life apart. But my forensic accounting instincts refused to let me log off. There was still one missing piece to this horrific puzzle. I needed to know exactly how deep his relationship went with the corrupt medical professionals at the fertility clinic. I needed to understand exactly how he had orchestrated the psychiatric hold with Dr. Evans. I opened the final compressed folder on the mirrored drive. It was an archived bundle of secure emails routed through a private server. I ran a quick keyword search for the name of our fertility clinic. The system immediately filtered out hundreds of unrelated messages, leaving a single isolated thread containing 32 separate emails. I clicked on the very first message, dated over 3 years ago. This was right before we began our very first round of in vitro fertilization. The email was not sent to Dr. Evans. It was sent to a man named Gregory Vance, who was the senior laboratory technician and lead embryologist at the clinic. I stared at the screen as my eyes scanned the sterile clinical text. The subject line read, Cycle 1 Status Report. The message from the technician was brief and entirely transactional. It read, the retrieval was highly successful. The subject produced 8 healthy grade A embryos. They are currently incubating and highly viable, awaiting your final instructions for the transfer protocol. My heart slammed against my ribs. I clearly remembered that exact day. I remembered waking up from the anesthesia in a cold, sterile recovery room. I remembered David sitting by my bed, holding my hand and looking deeply into my eyes. He had told me with tears running down his face that the retrieval had completely failed. He told me my eggs were not viable and that my body was simply too weak to sustain a pregnancy. I had cried so hard I physically vomited. I had spent months drowning in a suffocating ocean of guilt, believing I was fundamentally broken and entirely incapable of giving my husband the family he desperately wanted. My hands started to shake violently as I scrolled down to read David's reply to the technician. David's email was completely devoid of any human emotion. It read, "Dispose of 7 embryos immediately. Flag the remaining one as non-viable, but proceed with the standard transfer procedure tomorrow to maintain the illusion of treatment. The agreed-upon sum of $50,000 has just been transferred to your offshore cryptocurrency wallet. Do not contact me again until cycle 2. The air in the hidden bunker turned instantly to ice. I could not breathe. I could not process the absolute sheer magnitude of the pure evil glowing on the monitors in front of me. I clicked the next email, then the next. I read through 3 solid years of systematic, calculated medical sabotage. Every single time I subjected my body to grueling, painful hormone injections, David was paying a corrupt laboratory technician tens of thousands of dollars to literally destroy my viable embryos. Every single time I bruised my stomach with synthetic chemicals and suffered through crippling nausea, he was orchestrating the murder of my unborn children. And the psychological torture did not end in the laboratory. The emails detailed exactly how he instructed the medical staff to slowly increase my hormone dosages to dangerous toxic levels. He wanted the side effects to be as severe and debilitating as possible. He wanted me to experience extreme fatigue mood swings and severe paranoia. He deliberately manufactured my physical and mental breakdown. He needed me to feel entirely worthless and completely dependent on him. He isolated me from my family and my career by convincing me that I was a barren, broken woman who was incredibly lucky to have a husband willing to endure her tragic medical failures. He broke my spirit on purpose. He kept me trapped in a perpetual state of agonizing grief so that I would never have the strength to question his finances or look into his corporate activities. He used my deepest, most desperate desire to become a mother as a weapon to completely destroy my life. The financial fraud was just money. The forged signatures and the stolen $20 million were just corporate crimes driven by simple human greed. But this was something entirely different. This was not greed. This was a profound sociopathic violation of my body, my soul, and my fundamental human rights. He had treated me like a disposable laboratory animal in his sick, twisted experiment. I did not cry. The sheer weight of the betrayal completely bypassed the emotional center of my brain and slammed directly into my primal survival instincts. The tears simply refused to form. A cold, dark, unadulterated rage flooded my system, burning away every last remaining shred of fear, hesitation, and vulnerability. I was no longer just fighting for my freedom or my father's trust fund. I was fighting to completely eradicate a monster from the face of the earth. I rapidly downloaded the entire email thread and the corresponding digital receipts for the cryptocurrency transfers. I cross-referenced the digital wallet addresses and pulled the undeniable blockchain data, proving David had paid the corrupt technician over $200,000 in blood money. I compiled the medical sabotage evidence into a heavily encrypted master file. I picked up my phone and dialed Maya's number again. She answered on the very first ring. I did not bother saying hello. My voice was dangerously calm and completely hollowed out. "Maya," I said, staring blankly at the glowing blue monitors. "I just found the emails from the fertility clinic. He paid the embryologist to destroy my embryos. He did it every single time. He poisoned me with the hormones to hide his financial tracks and keep me submissive." There was a long, horrifying silence on the other end of the line. I could hear Maya's breath catch in her throat. When she finally spoke, her voice was trembling with a cold, terrifying fury. "Are you absolutely certain, Sarah?" she asked. "Do you have the undeniable proof?" "I have everything," I replied. "I have the receipts, the communications, and the exact dates. I am sending the master file to your secure server right now. The financial fraud is going to put him in a federal prison, but this medical conspiracy is going to absolutely destroy him. I want the embryologist arrested. I want Dr. Evans stripped of his medical license and thrown in a cell, and I want David to lose absolutely everything he has ever loved." Maya took a deep, steadying breath. "Consider the counterattack fully mobilized," she said firmly. "I am drafting the federal racketeering and medical malpractice lawsuits immediately. We are not just going to drain his accounts, Sarah. We are going to burn his entire kingdom straight to the ground, and we are going to salt the earth so nothing ever grows there again. Finish playing the part. I will see you on Thursday night. I hung up the phone and turned off the monitors. I sat in the pitch-black bunker for a long time, letting the cold, dark rage completely consume me. David thought I was a broken, barren wife, but he was about to learn that a woman who has had everything stolen from her is the most dangerous creature in the world. Wednesday morning broke with a heavy gray sky over the Chicago suburbs. I stood by the large bay window in the living room and watched David adjust his silk tie in the reflection of his Tesla window. He looked incredibly rested and completely arrogant. He had kissed me on the forehead before walking out the door, telling me to take my pills and rest my fragile mind. I played the part flawlessly. I offered him a weak, trembling smile and told him I would sleep all day. The second his car disappeared around the corner of our manicured street, the fragile, sick housewife routine evaporated completely. I turned away from the window and walked straight to the hidden guest room. The heavy steel door of my bunker clicked shut behind me, sealing me inside my digital war room. I booted up the encrypted servers and initiated a secure video link with Maya. Her face appeared on the center monitor. She was sitting in her massive corner office in downtown Chicago, wearing a sharp navy blue suit. The skyline loomed behind her. She looked like a general preparing for a massive siege. "Good morning, Sarah," she said, her voice crisp and fully alert. "The racketeering paperwork is drafted. I have a federal judge on standby for tomorrow evening. How is our financial patient doing?" I pulled up the cloned ledger from David's phone. "The patient is bleeding out," I replied, my fingers hovering over the mechanical keyboard. "But he does not know it yet. I am initiating the asset transfer protocol right now. This was the most delicate and dangerous phase of the entire operation. David had stolen $20 million from the private retirement portfolios of his most elite clients at Vanguard Financial. He had routed that stolen money into 3 fraudulent shell companies registered in Delaware under my forged signature. If I simply transferred the money back to his clients, his automated security alerts would immediately trigger. He would know I was inside his system, and he would execute the psychiatric hold before I could finish. I had to drain the actual funds while leaving the digital illusion of the money completely intact. I needed him to walk onto that gala stage tomorrow night, fully believing he had $20 million to fund his hostile takeover. I opened a secure terminal and accessed the banking portal for the 3 Delaware shell companies. The combined balance glowed brightly on my screen, showing exactly $20,400,000. It was a staggering amount of stolen wealth. I took a deep breath and began to write a custom execution script. I was a senior forensic accountant, and I knew exactly how banking interfaces communicated with backend servers. I wrote a localized spoofing program designed to hijack the visual display of David's specific banking application. Maya watched my screen share with intense focus. "Are you absolutely sure the ghost ledger will hold?" she asked. "If he checks his balance from a different device, the illusion might break." "It will hold," I assured her, typing rapidly. "I am not just spoofing his phone. I am rewriting the application programming interface for the entire account. Whenever any device requests the balance for these 3 specific routing numbers, my script will intercept the request and report the original 20 million. But the actual vault will be completely empty." "Where exactly are we sending the capital?" Maya asked, leaning closer to her camera. I opened the routing channel Maya had established for me the night before. She had used her elite legal connections to quietly open an impenetrable blind offshore trust in the Cayman Islands. The trust was fully insured, completely untraceable, and legally insulated from any domestic corporate seizures. It was the perfect black hole for David's stolen empire. I linked the routing numbers from the Delaware shell companies directly to the Cayman Trust. I initiated a slow drip transfer protocol. Moving $20 million in a single massive wire transfer would trigger international banking alarms. Instead, I programmed the server to slice the total amount into 10,000 smaller automated transactions. The money would bounce through dozens of encrypted proxy servers across Europe and Asia before finally resting securely in the Caribbean. It was a digital labyrinth that even the most advanced federal investigators would need months to untangle. David had absolutely no chance of stopping it. I hovered my finger over the enter key. This was the point of no return. Once I pressed this button, the $20 million he embezzled would vanish from his control forever. He would be left holding a fraudulent company under my name with absolutely zero capital to back it up. When the federal authorities eventually audited the accounts, they would find my spoofing script tracing directly back to his personal devices, proving he tried to hide the missing funds. I pressed the key. The black terminal screen exploded with scrolling green lines of code. The transfer sequence initiated flawlessly. I watched the actual balance of the Delaware accounts begin to plummet in real time. 19 million, 15 million, 10 million. The stolen money was hemorrhaging out of his control at a rate of $2 million per minute. But on the secondary monitor displaying the spoofed interface David would see on his phone, the balance remained a solid, unwavering 20 million. "It is done," I whispered, leaning back in my leather chair. "The funds are secured in the offshore trust. He is completely broke, Maya. He has absolutely nothing left but a mountain of forged documents and a federal prison sentence waiting for him." Maya smiled. It was a cold, calculating smile that would terrify any opposing counsel. "Brilliant work, Sarah," she said. "The trap is officially set. Now we just need him to walk onto that stage tomorrow night and confidently claim ownership of those empty accounts in front of 500 people. Remember your part. Keep him completely comfortable. Do not give him a single reason to panic. I will play the perfect victim I promised." I closed the video link and watched the final few thousands of dollars drain into the offshore account. The balance hit absolute zero. I locked the servers and stood up from the desk. A profound sense of victory washed over me. I had just successfully disarmed a highly dangerous corporate predator without ever leaving my house. I felt a powerful rush of pure adrenaline. The heavy brain fog and the agonizing fatigue from the fertility hormones were entirely gone. I was finally back in control of my own life. I walked out of the hidden bunker and locked the reinforced steel door behind me. I moved through the silent, empty house and walked into the massive gourmet kitchen. I desperately needed a strong cup of black coffee. I moved to the espresso machine and began to grind the dark roasted beans. The mechanical grinding noise filled the quiet kitchen. I stood at the Marble Island counter feeling a deep, incredible sense of peace for the first time in over 3 years. The plan was flawless. David was going to lose his firm, his money, and his freedom. But as the hot espresso began to drip into my ceramic mug, the heavy silence of the house was suddenly shattered. The front doorbell rang. It was a sharp, piercing sound that echoed loudly through the high-vaulted ceilings of the foyer. I froze. My hand stopped perfectly still on the marble counter. I glanced at the digital clock on the wall. It was barely 11 in the morning. David was in the middle of a massive board meeting downtown. He never came home this early. We were not expecting any deliveries, and the gated community security usually called before allowing any maintenance workers inside. The doorbell rang again. This time it was longer and far more aggressive. Whoever was standing on my front porch was incredibly impatient. I abandoned my coffee and walked silently out of the kitchen. I kept my footsteps light, pressing my weight into the edges of the hardwood floor to avoid making any noise. I moved into the dark, formal dining room and pressed my back against the wall. I pulled out my cell phone and opened the live feed for the front porch security cameras. The high-definition color video loaded instantly on my screen. I stared at the image, and a cold wave of absolute fury washed over my entire body. Standing on my front porch, wearing a tight designer trench coat and oversized black sunglasses, was Jessica. She looked incredibly annoyed. She was aggressively tapping her expensive high heels against the stone welcome mat. She reached out and pressed the doorbell a third time, leaning heavily on the button. She held a thick manila folder tucked tightly under her left arm. My mind raced to process this massive sudden variable. Jessica was supposed to be at the office with David preparing the final documents for the hostile takeover. She had absolutely no logical reason to be standing on my front porch in the middle of the workday, unless she was getting impatient, unless she wanted to accelerate their twisted timeline. David had meticulously planned to execute the psychiatric hold on Friday morning. But Jessica was 25 years old, incredibly greedy and deeply arrogant. She had already left her cheap lipstick in my bathroom to taunt me. Now she was physically coming to my house while my husband was away. She wanted to survey the massive estate she believed was about to become hers. She wanted to look the broken, barren wife in the eye and assert her absolute dominance. I watched her through the camera feed as she pulled out her phone and started typing a message. She was probably texting David complaining that the crazy lady was not answering the door. Maya had explicitly warned me to avoid any direct conflict. She told me to play the submissive victim and buy us the remaining 48 hours. If I opened that door and unleashed the forensic accountant hiding inside me, I would completely blow the operation. Jessica would run straight back to David and tell him I was not heavily medicated. He would instantly panic and call the private doctor to authorize the emergency medical hold today instead of Friday. I had to make a choice. I could pretend I was deeply asleep and ignore the door hoping she would eventually leave, or I could open the door and give her exactly the pathetic, broken performance she came here to see. Jessica aggressively pounded her fist against the heavy wooden door. "Open the door, Sarah!" she shouted, her shrill voice barely muffled by the thick wood. "I know you are in there. David's car is gone, but your pathetic little sedan is still in the driveway. Open the door right now. We need to have a very important conversation about your future." Her sheer audacity was breathtaking. She was a junior associate, sleeping with my husband, plotting to steal my family trust fund, and now she was demanding entry into my home to threaten my future. I locked my phone and slipped it into my pocket. I took a deep, steadying breath and let my shoulders slump forward. I relaxed my facial muscles, letting my expression drop into a mask of complete exhaustion and deep confusion. I dragged my feet slowly across the foyer floor, making sure she could hear me coming. I reached out with a trembling hand and slowly unlocked the deadbolt. I pulled the heavy front door open just a few inches. I looked at Jessica through the narrow gap, blinking my eyes slowly, as if the bright morning sunlight was physically painful. Jessica pushed her sunglasses up onto the top of her head. She looked at my pale face and my loose clothing. A wide, incredibly arrogant smirk spread across her face. She placed her hand flat against the heavy wooden door and forcefully pushed it open, stepping completely uninvited right into my foyer. The trigger was pulled. The mistress had just walked directly into my trap. I stood in the grand foyer, holding the heavy wooden door open just a few inches. Jessica did not wait for an invitation. She placed her manicured hand flat against the solid mahogany wood and forcefully shoved it open. She stepped past me, crossing the threshold into my home with an incredibly arrogant stride. The sharp clicking of her designer stiletto heels echoed loudly against the imported marble floor tiles. The heavy, nauseating scent of her cheap vanilla perfume instantly filled the enclosed space, suffocating the clean morning air. She pushed her oversized black sunglasses up onto the crown of her head and took a long, deliberate look around my massive foyer. She was surveying the property like a conqueror who had just breached the castle walls. She looked up at the towering crystal chandelier hanging from the vaulted ceiling, and a greedy, satisfied smile slowly spread across her face. "What are you doing inside my house, Jessica?" I asked, my voice trembling intentionally. I took a slow, unsteady step backward, wrapping my arms tightly around my own waist to make myself appear physically small and incredibly vulnerable. I let my shoulders hunch forward completely, hiding the ruthless forensic accountant standing just beneath the surface. "David is not here," I stammered, acting completely disoriented. "He is at the office in a board meeting. You're not supposed to be here." Jessica turned her head and looked at me with absolute unvarnished disgust. She looked at my pale face, my loose beige clothing, and my messy hair. She let out a sharp, cruel laugh that bounced off the high walls. "I know David is at the office, Sarah," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "I am not here to see David. I came here specifically to see you. We need to have a very serious conversation. Woman to woman, before things get incredibly ugly for you this week." She did not wait for my response. She walked confidently out of the foyer and made her way directly into the formal living room. I followed her, slowly dragging my feet against the floorboards, playing the role of the terrified, submissive wife to absolute perfection. When I entered the living room, she was already making herself completely at home. She tossed her expensive leather handbag onto my custom Italian sofa and stood by the massive stone fireplace, running her fingers admiringly over the mantel. "This really is a spectacular house, Sarah," she murmured, keeping her back to me. "The architecture is stunning. The natural light in this room is completely flawless. It really is a massive shame that you are far too mentally unstable to appreciate any of it." I stood near the entryway, clutching the fabric of my dress. "Please, Jessica." I whispered, my voice cracking perfectly on the last syllable. Please, just leave. My head is pounding. I need to take my medication and go back to sleep. David said, I need to rest my mind. Jessica turned around and crossed her arms over her chest. She stared at me with cold, dead, predatory eyes. You can drop the pathetic, sick wife routine with me. Sarah, she sneered. I know exactly what is in those pills David has been feeding you. I know exactly what they are doing to your brain. You are not just tired, you're completely losing your grip on reality, and we both know it. By Friday morning, you will not even remember your own name. She walked over to the glass coffee table and slammed the thick manila folder she had been carrying right down in the center of it. The loud smack made me physically jump backward, acting startled and deeply afraid. Sit down, Sarah, she commanded sharply, pointing a long, perfectly manicured finger at the armchair across from her. Sit down and listen to me very carefully, because I am about to offer you the only lifeline you have left in this entire miserable world. I slowly walked over to the armchair and sat down, perching nervously on the very edge of the cushion. I kept my eyes fixed on the floor, completely avoiding her gaze. Inside my chest, my heart was beating with a steady, freezing rhythm. I knew that directly above Jessica's head, hidden flawlessly inside the smoke detector, was a high-definition security camera equipped with a highly sensitive microphone array. Every single word of this extortion was being recorded and streamed directly to my secure offshore servers. Jessica leaned over the coffee table and flipped the manila folder open. Inside was a thick stack of legal documents. I recognized the formatting immediately. It was a quitclaim deed transferring the sole legal ownership of the suburban estate directly to David. David is a very generous man. Jessica began, her tone sickeningly sweet and highly patronizing. He wants to make sure you are taken care of, even though your mental health has completely destroyed your marriage. But he cannot have a crazy woman living in this massive estate. It is a massive liability. So here is the deal, Sarah. You are going to sign this quitclaim deed right now. You are going to legally surrender all of your rights to this property and sign it over to David. In exchange, he will secure a quiet, comfortable room for you in a standard assisted living facility. I looked up at her, my eyes wide with manufactured terror. I cannot do that, I whispered frantically, shaking my head. This is my home. I helped build this life. Where am I supposed to go? Jessica leaned closer, resting her hands on the glass table. Her face was inches from mine, and her eyes were filled with pure, malicious intent. If you do not sign these papers right now, Sarah, things are going to get much, much worse for you. Do you genuinely think David is going to let you stay here? Do you have any idea what is happening on Friday morning? I swallowed hard, letting a single tear spill over my lower eyelid and track slowly down my cheek. What is happening on Friday? I asked, my voice barely audible. Jessica smiled a truly terrifying sociopathic smile. On Friday morning, the private ambulance is going to pull right up to that beautiful front door, she whispered maliciously. Dr. Evans has already signed the involuntary psychiatric hold petition. The judge is stamping it on Friday. If you refuse to sign this house over to us today, David is going to execute that order. They are going to drag you out of this house in a straitjacket, Sarah. They are going to lock you inside a padded cell in the highest security wing of the state psychiatric hospital. You will be heavily sedated around the clock. You will never see the outside of a locked ward for the rest of your miserable life. The sheer level of her arrogance was absolutely staggering. She was 25 years old, sitting in my living room and actively extorting me with a forged medical mandate. She fully believed she held the power of life and death over my entire future. She thought she was an untouchable mastermind. She had absolutely no idea she was sitting right inside a massive digital trap. I buried my face in my hands and let out a loud, agonizing sob. I forced my shoulders to shake violently. I wailed into the empty room, playing the absolute broken, desperate victim. Please, I cried out, my voice muffled by my hands. Please, do not let them lock me away, Jessica. Please, I am begging you, Ging. I am not crazy. I just need to stop taking the injections. Please tell David to stop the doctors. Jessica stood up from the sofa and looked down at me with absolute triumphant disgust. She had completely broken me. She had won. She reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a heavy gold pen, tossing it onto the legal documents. "Sign the papers, Sarah," she demanded coldly. "Sign the papers, and I will tell David to cancel the ambulance. Otherwise, pack a small bag for the asylum. You have exactly 24 hours to make your decision. I will be back tomorrow morning to collect the signed documents." She did not wait for me to answer. She picked up her handbag, turned on her stiletto heels, and confidently strutted out of the living room. I remained hunched over in the armchair, sobbing loudly into my hands as I listened to her footsteps echo across the marble foyer. The heavy wooden front door opened and slammed shut with a loud, definitive thud. The second the lock clicked into place, my sobbing stopped entirely. The tears instantly dried on my cheeks. I slowly lowered my hands from my face and sat up perfectly straight. I looked directly up at the smoke detector on the ceiling. I offered the hidden camera a slow, freezing, cold smile. The extortion was completely documented. Jessica had just handed Maya the final piece of undeniable evidence needed to guarantee her a massive federal prison sentence for criminal conspiracy and extortion. I stood up from the armchair and walked calmly over to the bay window. I pulled the heavy silk curtain back just an inch and watched Jessica walking down the driveway toward her parked car. She was holding her cell phone out in front of her, rapidly typing a message. I knew exactly who she was texting. I reached into my dress pocket and pulled out my own encrypted device. I opened the mirrored messaging application I had cloned from David's phone the night before. The intercepted text message from Jessica popped onto my screen in real time. The message read, "The crazy lady is completely broken." She was literally sobbing and begging on the floor. She is absolutely terrified of the psych hold on Friday. The house is basically ours. We are completely cleared for the corporate announcement tomorrow night. 10 seconds later, a reply from David appeared on the mirrored screen. His message read, "Perfect work, baby." I knew she was too weak to fight back. "Wear the red dress tomorrow night to the Vanguard Financial Corporate Gala. When I announce the hostile takeover on that stage, you will be standing right by my side as the new queen of the firm." I locked my phone and slipped it back into my pocket. I watched Jessica's car speed away down the quiet suburban street. They were incredibly arrogant. They had completely finalized their timeline. Thursday night was the corporate gala. David was going to stand on a brightly lit stage in front of 500 elite investors and partners to announce his hostile takeover using the $20 million he thought he had stolen from his clients. He was planning to publicly humiliate me and crown his mistress right in front of the entire financial sector. I turned away from the window and looked around my beautiful empty house. They thought I was a weak, pathetic housewife, waiting to be dragged away in an ambulance. They thought they had backed a helpless animal into a corner, but they had actually backed a highly trained predator directly into her own hunting ground. The financial assets were completely secured in the offshore trust. The medical conspiracy was fully documented. The federal extortion was recorded in high-definition audio and video. Maya had the federal judge on standby. Every single trap was perfectly set. I walked toward the grand staircase to prepare my wardrobe for tomorrow evening. The terrified, submissive wife was officially dead. The ruthless forensic accountant was going to the gala. Wednesday evening descended upon the massive suburban house. The interior was completely silent. I sat perfectly still on the edge of the sofa in the formal living room. The manila folder Jessica had left rested heavily in my lap. Inside were the quitclaim deed and a comprehensive financial power of attorney. David wanted me to surrender everything willingly to avoid the messy complications of a forced psychiatric hold. Maya had anticipated this move. She instructed me to sign the documents, but to intentionally use a slight variation of my legal signature. It was a subtle forensic discrepancy that completely invalidated the contract, but would easily pass David's visual inspection. I held a gold pen in my trembling hand and stared blankly at the front door. At exactly 7 o'clock, the heavy wooden door unlocked and swung open. David walked into the foyer holding his leather briefcase. The anticipation of his hostile takeover radiated from his pores. He walked into the living room and stopped when he saw me sitting in the dark. I had deliberately turned off all the lamps, leaving only the pale moonlight to illuminate my face. I looked completely hollowed out. I had spent the last hour mentally channeling every ounce of pain and betrayal I had endured over the last 5 years. When I looked up at him, my eyes were red and swollen. My shoulders were slumped in absolute defeat. David let out a long, patronizing sigh. "Why are you sitting in the dark, Sarah?" he asked, his voice laced with artificial concern. "Have you been crying again?" I slowly stood up. My legs shook violently, playing the role of a woman whose spirit had been entirely snapped. "I cannot do this anymore, David," I whispered. My voice was raspy and incredibly weak. "I cannot fight you. I cannot fight the doctors or the medication or the terrifying hallucinations. Jessica came here today. She told me about the psychiatric hold on Friday. Please, David, do not let them lock me in that hospital. I am begging you." David crossed his arms over his chest and looked down at me with absolute sickening smugness. He did not deny sending his mistress to extort his wife. He simply smiled a cold, victorious smile. He genuinely believed his psychological torture had reached its flawless conclusion. "I told you, Sarah," he said smoothly, taking a slow, confident step toward me. "Your mind is deteriorating. You are a massive liability to my firm. I have a moral obligation to make sure you receive the intense psychiatric care you so desperately need. Dr. Evans is fully prepared to execute the court order." I held out the manila folder, offering it to him with trembling hands. I signed them. I sobbed openly, letting the tears stream down my pale cheeks. I signed the quitclaim deed and the full power of attorney documents. "You have complete control over my trust fund and my medical decisions. Just promise me I can go to a quiet, assisted living facility. Please do not send me to the state asylum. I surrender, David. You win. I just want peace." David snatched the folder from my hands. He eagerly flipped it open and quickly scanned the bottom of the legal documents. He saw my signature. He saw the ultimate legal prize he had spent years plotting to steal. The sheer level of arrogance and triumph that washed over his face made me physically nauseous. He actually let out a short, satisfied laugh. He reached out and gently patted my cheek as if I were a frightened, obedient dog. "You made the right choice, sweetheart," he murmured, his voice dripping with condescending pity. "This is what is best for everyone. I will call Dr. Evans and cancel the ambulance. You just go upstairs and take a double dose of your sedatives. Sleep through the weekend. I will have my legal team process these documents tomorrow morning before the corporate gala." He closed the folder and tucked it tightly under his arm. "I need to head back downtown," he announced, casually turning his back on me. "The partners want to finalize the hostile takeover announcement for tomorrow night. It is going to be a very late evening. I will stay at the hotel near the venue so I do not wake you." He was lying. There was no late meeting with the partners. He was going straight to a luxury hotel room to celebrate his absolute victory with Jessica. He was going to drink expensive champagne and laugh about the pathetic, broken wife he had just successfully destroyed. I watched him walk out of the dark living room. I listened to the front door open and then slam shut. The heavy deadbolt clicked securely into place. I stood frozen in the dark living room, listening to the low hum of his car engine start in the driveway and quickly fade away down the quiet street. The second the house was completely silent, my tears instantly vanished. My trembling hands became perfectly steady. I stood up, perfectly straight, and rolled my shoulders back, stretching the tight muscles I had been suppressing. I walked over to the bay window and watched the red taillights of his car disappear into the dark suburban night. David thought he had just secured his empire. He thought he was walking into Thursday holding a loaded weapon. He had absolutely no idea he was holding a fake document and an empty bank account. He had just handed me a completely uninterrupted 12-hour window. It was exactly what Maya and I needed. The false surrender was completely successful. Now it was time to rig the execution. I pulled my encrypted phone from my pocket and sent a single text message to Maya. I told her the target was moving and the venue was clear. I walked straight to the hidden underground bunker to pack my heavy digital equipment. The countdown to his absolute destruction had officially begun. Thursday afternoon arrived with freezing clarity. I stood in my closet staring at the loose beige clothes I had worn for the last 6 months. They were the physical embodiment of my manufactured sickness. I reached out and violently shoved them all to the far end of the rack. Today I was shedding the skin of the fragile, barren wife. I reached into the protective garment bag hanging in the very back and pulled out a tailored designer dress I had not worn since my days as a senior forensic accountant. It was a razor-sharp, knee-length dress made of heavy black silk with a structured collar and asymmetrical lines. It did not look like the dress of a supportive housewife. It looked like absolute armor. I slipped it on and felt the cool, heavy fabric mold perfectly to my steady frame. I sat down at my vanity. For months, David had watched me purposefully accentuate the dark circles under my tired eyes. I applied expensive foundation and contoured my cheekbones until they looked sharp enough to cut glass. I applied a deep matte crimson lipstick that was completely elegant and incredibly intimidating. I swept my dark hair back into a severe, tight bun. When I finally stood up and looked in the full-length mirror, the terrified woman from the lobby was entirely gone. Staring back at me was an apex predator, ready to slaughter her prey. I grabbed my leather briefcase containing the encrypted servers and walked out the front door, locking it securely behind me. I drove straight to the Grand Plaza Hotel in downtown Chicago, where Vanguard Financial was hosting their massive corporate gala. I parked in the underground garage directly next to Maya's black town car. She was leaning against the hood wearing a structured emerald green pantsuit holding 2 laminated vendor passes. She looked at my black dress and offered a slow, deeply approving nod. "The victim is officially dead," she noted, handing me a pass. "Let us go completely bury the husband." We clipped the passes to our lapels and walked confidently through the bustling loading dock, entering the service corridors. The venue was an absolute hive of chaotic activity. Hundreds of event staff were rushing around carrying massive floral arrangements and cases of expensive champagne. We easily blended into the background, moving with absolute authority. Maya had spent the morning thoroughly researching the hotel layout and the outsourced audio-visual company David had hired. We took the service elevator up to the catwalk level overlooking the main grand ballroom. The control booth was a small dark room suspended directly above the stage, housing the massive digital projectors and the master soundboard. We opened the heavy acoustic door and walked inside. A single young technician wearing a black polo shirt was sitting at the massive console eating a sandwich. Maya did not hesitate. She walked directly up to him and placed a thick, unmarked white envelope onto his keyboard. Inside the envelope was exactly $10,000 in untraceable cash. The technician looked at the envelope and then looked up at Maya's terrifyingly calm expression. "We need this room entirely to ourselves for the next 3 hours," she said, her voice completely flat. "You are going to take your dinner break right now. You're going to leave your master credentials logged in on that console, and you are going to forget you ever saw us. If anyone asks, you were downstairs checking the microphone batteries." The technician swallowed hard, pocketed the heavy envelope, and walked straight out of the door without saying a single word. The second the heavy door clicked shut, I moved instantly to the master console. I placed my leather briefcase onto the table and pulled out my encrypted servers. The hotel audio-visual system was a standard commercial setup, making it incredibly easy to manipulate. I pulled the main optical output cable from the hotel computer and bypassed their central processing unit entirely. I hardwired the venue projectors and the entire surround sound speaker array directly into my own heavily encrypted digital war room. I opened my laptop and established a secure wireless handshake with the main console. My fingers flew rapidly across the illuminated keyboard. I was not just preparing a simple slideshow. I was building a completely automated digital guillotine. I mapped the audio feed from David's car recording directly to the master volume faders. I routed the undeniable high-definition video of Jessica extorting me to the primary presentation screens behind the main stage. Finally, I created a custom master override switch. No matter what buttons David pressed on his remote control, my computer would maintain absolute dictatorial control over every single screen and speaker in the entire ballroom. Maya stood silently by the tinted glass window, looking down at the massive empty ballroom. I ran a silent diagnostic test on the network. The data stream was flawless. I secured the cables and closed my laptop screen halfway, leaving the execution program running in the background. "It is done," I said, stepping up to the window. "We have absolute control." At exactly 6:30 in the evening, the heavy golden doors of the grand ballroom finally swung open to the public. The corporate gala officially began. Maya and I stood perfectly still in the dark elevated control booth, looking down through the glass. We watched as hundreds of wealthy investors and elite executives flooded into the beautifully lit room. The ambient noise of classical string music and networking drifted up to our hidden sanctuary. And then I saw them. David walked confidently through the main entrance wearing a custom-tailored black tuxedo and looking incredibly arrogant. Right by his side, clinging tightly to his arm, was Jessica, wearing a bright red dress and laughing loudly. They walked directly toward the front row, VIP tables, believing they were the absolute king and queen of the world. They thought they had entirely broken me. They had absolutely no idea the executioner was standing right above them, tightly holding the lever. The grand ballroom of the Grand Plaza Hotel was a masterclass in corporate opulence. From the darkened control booth, Maya and I looked down at 500 elite guests. The room was bathed in a warm glow from the crystal chandeliers. Waiters in crisp white jackets circulated effortlessly, carrying silver trays loaded with expensive champagne. This was the absolute apex of the Chicago financial district. Every major investor, hedge fund manager, and rival firm executive was currently standing in that room. It was the perfect ecosystem of wealth and power. Right in the very center of it all was my husband. David worked the room with the practiced ease of a seasoned politician. He wore a custom-tailored black tuxedo that fit perfectly. He shook hands, laughed at terrible jokes, and radiated the untouchable arrogance of a man who believed he had just conquered the world. Beside him, clinging to his arm, was Jessica. She wore a completely inappropriate bright crimson dress that plunged deeply at the neckline. She looked incredibly smug, soaking in the jealous glances of the older wives, fully embracing her premature coronation as the new queen of Vanguard Financial. At 7:15, the ambient string music faded out entirely. A hush fell over the crowd as the senior managing partner stepped up to the acrylic podium on the main stage. He tapped the microphone and welcomed the city's elite, thanking them for their continued trust in the firm. He quickly pivoted to the real reason for the extravagant gathering, speaking about bold new directions and aggressive market expansion. Then he introduced David, calling him the brilliant architect of their most lucrative financial maneuver to date. The ballroom erupted into polite applause. David buttoned his tuxedo jacket and walked up the carpeted steps, moving with a terrifyingly calm, predatory grace. He shook the senior partner's hand and stepped up to the microphone. Jessica moved to stand just slightly off to the side of the stage, positioning herself perfectly in the spotlight. She looked up at David with an expression of pure, unadulterated greed. David grabbed the edges of the acrylic podium and looked out over the sea of wealthy investors. He let the silence stretch for a long, dramatic moment before he finally spoke. His voice echoed powerfully through the high-definition surround sound system that I was currently holding completely hostage. "Good evening, everyone," David said, his tone dripping with artificial humility. "We are standing tonight on the absolute precipice of a massive historic shift in the financial sector. For the past 6 months, my team and I have been quietly orchestrating a complete restructuring of our market approach. Tonight, I am incredibly proud to announce that Vanguard Financial is officially acquiring our largest competitor." The crowd gasped and murmured in sudden excitement. It was a massive revelation. But before David revealed the financial details of his stolen empire, he paused. He lowered his head slightly, allowing a shadow of deep manufactured sorrow to cross his handsome face. He was an absolute sociopath, performing a rehearsed emotional script. "Before we look at the future," he continued, his voice dropping to a soft, sympathetic pitch, "I need to take a brief moment to acknowledge the present. As many of you know, my beautiful wife Sarah could not be here tonight. She is currently at home, battling a very severe and rapid mental health decline." The room grew dead silent. Elite executives and their wives looked up at him with profound pity. David let out a heavy theatrical sigh. "It has been an incredibly dark, agonizing journey for our family." He lied flawlessly to 500 people. "Her illness has tested my strength every single day. But I push forward because I know that is exactly what she would want me to do. I am building this new empire to secure her medical care and honor the brilliant woman she used to be." Standing in the dark control booth, I felt my fingernails dig violently into my palms. The sheer magnitude of his public gaslighting was physically nauseating. He was using the medical trauma he intentionally inflicted upon me to buy sympathy and build his corporate legend. He was standing on a brightly lit stage, playing the tragic hero, while actively plotting to lock me in a psychiatric ward tomorrow. Maya placed a firm hand on my shoulder. "Hold your fire," she whispered. "Wait for the exact moment." Down on the stage, David took a deep breath and looked over at Jessica, offering her a warm public smile. "And I also want to thank my brilliant junior associate, Jessica," he said smoothly. "She has been my absolute rock during this incredibly difficult transition, stepping up to handle the massive workload while my wife is incapacitated." Jessica beamed with pride, offering a modest wave. It was sickening. Now David announced, pulling a sleek black remote control from his tuxedo pocket. "Let us look at the finalized acquisition documents that will change this industry forever." He pointed the remote directly at the massive projector screens suspended behind the stage. He confidently pressed the button, expecting to display the forged financial ledgers backed by the $20 million he thought he had stolen. The laser receptor blinked green, acknowledging his command. But absolutely nothing happened. He pressed the button a second time, pushing harder against the plastic. The high-definition screens did not show his brilliant corporate strategy. Instead, they violently flickered and then went completely pitch black. The bright stage lights instantly cut out, plunging David and Jessica into deep, dark shadows. A wave of total confusion ripped through the elite guests. The microphone suddenly let out a sharp, deafening screech of electronic feedback, making several investors cover their ears. David tapped the microphone, his confident mask slipping for the very first time. "Hello," he said, his voice sounding suddenly very small. "Can we get the audiovisual team to fix this immediately?" I stood up in the dark booth and cracked my knuckles. The audiovisual team was not going to fix a single thing. I leaned over my laptop and initiated the absolute destruction of his life. The massive high-definition projection screens, suspended directly behind the main stage, remained completely pitch black. The suffocating silence inside the grand ballroom of the Grand Plaza Hotel stretched into a terrifying vacuum. 500 of the most elite financial executives in the city of Chicago held their collective breath, waiting for the technical difficulties to be resolved. But this was absolutely not a sudden digital malfunction. This was a highly orchestrated corporate execution. Up in the darkened elevated control booth, I gave Maya a single sharp nod of confirmation. She pulled a heavy black walkie-talkie from the pocket of her tailored emerald green pantsuit and pressed the transmission button. "Execute protocol lockdown," she commanded, her voice cold and absolute. Down on the main floor, 4 massive pairs of golden mahogany doors served as the only physical exits to the sprawling ballroom. Maya's private security team consisted of highly trained professionals dressed in inconspicuous black suits who had already positioned themselves at every single threshold during the speech. At her exact command, they simultaneously pulled the heavy brass handles inward. The massive wooden doors slammed shut with a deafening synchronized thud that echoed like a cannon blast across the silent room. The heavy steel deadbolts clicked securely into place. The financial elite of the city were officially trapped inside the venue. A low wave of panicked murmuring instantly rippled through the massive crowd. Several wealthy investors turned around in their plush seats, looking toward the back of the room with deep, profound confusion. Waiters stopped dead in their tracks, holding their silver champagne trays tightly against their chests, completely unsure of what was happening. The beautiful illusion of safety and control was completely shattered in a matter of mere seconds. I pushed open the heavy acoustic door to the hidden service stairwell and stepped out onto the plush crimson carpet of the main floor. The ambient golden light from the towering crystal chandeliers caught the sharp asymmetrical lines of my heavy black silk designer dress. I did not look anything like the frail, heavily medicated housewife David had just tragically described to his wealthy colleagues. I had spent the last 6 months wearing baggy clothes and hiding my face to appease his manufactured narrative. Tonight, I looked like an absolute force of nature. My posture was perfectly rigid, and my spine was as straight as a steel rod. My dark hair was pulled back into a severe tight bun, exposing the sharp contoured angles of my face and the deep matte crimson of my lipstick. I gripped a sleek wireless microphone tightly in my right hand, feeling the cool metal against my palm. I took my very first step down the center aisle of the ballroom, leaving the shadows completely behind me. The rhythmic clicking of my designer stiletto heels against the polished floorboards cut through the nervous whispers of the crowd like a ticking metronome, counting down to a massive explosion. The guests sitting in the back rows were the first people to notice me stepping into the light. An older woman dripping in expensive diamond jewelry, gasped out loud and violently grabbed her husband's arm, spilling her drink onto the table. The whispering rapidly escalated into a chaotic symphony of absolute shock. Sarah, a senior managing partner, whispered loudly, standing up abruptly from his front row VIP table. "Is that Sarah?" The sea of 500 elite guests began to physically part for me as I walked forward. They leaned away from the center aisle, pulling their chairs back and creating a wide, clear path directly toward the main stage. I kept my eyes locked dead ahead entirely, ignoring the hundreds of staring faces and the pointing fingers. I could hear their frantic, hushed conversations as I walked past their expensive tables. "David just said she was completely incapacitated," one hedge fund manager muttered to his colleague, looking at me with wide eyes. "She looks absolutely terrifying," a woman whispered to her friend, clutching her evening bag. The false narrative David had spent 6 months meticulously crafting was disintegrating right in front of their eyes. He had sold them a tragic story of a broken, barren woman whose mind had violently collapsed under the weight of severe mental illness and fertility treatments. He had used my supposed insanity to buy their sympathy and their absolute trust to secure his hostile takeover. But the woman walking down that center aisle possessed absolutely zero fragility. I was radiating pure, unadulterated dominance and lethal precision. Every single step I took dismantled another layer of his fraudulent existence. The heavy air in the ballroom crackled with intense electric tension, making it hard for anyone to breathe. The security guards hired by Vanguard Financial tried to step forward to intercept me before I reached the stage. They moved to block the aisle, wanting to protect their managing partner, but Maya's private team immediately intercepted them from the flanks. Her security personnel flashed their heavy metal credentials and aggressively shoved the venue guards back against the massive floral arrangements, pinning them to the walls. There was absolutely nothing standing between me and the man who had tried to systematically destroy my entire life. I reached the edge of the stage and stopped right at the bottom of the carpeted steps. I slowly lifted my head and locked eyes directly with my husband. David was gripping the clear acrylic podium so tightly his knuckles were completely white. The smug, arrogant smile he had worn just 3 minutes ago was entirely wiped from his face. The color rapidly drained from his cheeks, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. He looked exactly like a man who had just seen a demon rise directly from the depths of hell to drag him down. He was completely paralyzed by the sheer mathematical impossibility of my physical presence in this room. I was supposed to be heavily sedated in our suburban home, blindly waiting for a private ambulance to drag me to a secure psychiatric ward in the morning. I was supposed to be a helpless victim permanently trapped in his brilliant master plan. He opened his mouth to speak, but absolutely no sound came out of his throat. His brain simply could not process the catastrophic failure of his entire conspiracy. Beside him, Jessica was visibly trembling from head to toe. Her bright crimson dress suddenly looked incredibly cheap and completely out of place in the grand ballroom. She took a terrified step backward, bumping hard against the dark projector screen. She looked wildly around the room, searching for an exit, but the massive golden doors were firmly locked and heavily guarded by men in black suits. She was completely trapped on a brightly lit stage with the exact woman she had arrogantly extorted just 24 hours prior in my own living room. The sheer terror in her eyes was incredibly satisfying to witness. She realized in that exact moment that she was not the new queen of a financial empire. She was an accomplice to a massive federal crime, and the real owner of the estate had just arrived to collect her massive debt. She reached out and grabbed David's tuxedo sleeve, trying to pull him back away from the edge of the stage, but David was completely frozen in place like a statue. He finally managed to swallow the thick lump of pure terror lodged deep in his throat. He leaned heavily into the podium microphone. His survival instincts kicked in, but his arrogance blinded his logic. He completely forgot that the entire surround sound system was still active and broadcasting every single breath he took directly to the massive crowd. "Sarah," he hissed, his voice trembling with a toxic mixture of absolute panic and desperate fury. "What are you doing here? You're supposed to be in the clinic." The entire ballroom gasped in loud unison at his aggressive, threatening tone. The caring, tragic husband persona he had just performed for them was instantly obliterated by his own cruel words. He was aggressively demanding to know why his sick wife was not locked away inside a medical facility, right in front of his most important investors and board members. The silence that followed his horrifying statement was absolutely deafening. The senior partners at the front table stared at him with pure disgust, finally seeing the monster hiding beneath the expensive suit. I did not flinch. I did not break eye contact for a single millisecond. I stood at the bottom of the stairs, radiating the cold, calculating energy of a senior forensic accountant who had just successfully cornered her ultimate target. I slowly raised my own wireless microphone to my crimson lips. My voice echoed powerfully through the massive speakers, ringing out with absolute freezing clarity over the crowd. I brought the real documents, David. I said, my tone echoing like a heavy wooden gavel slamming down in a federal courtroom. I brought the real financial ledgers, and I brought the absolute truth. I lowered the microphone and stared directly into his terrified dead eyes, watching his entire world begin to violently crumble around his shoulders. I raised my left hand and pointed a single finger straight up toward the dark-tinted glass window of the elevated control booth. Up in the shadows, Maya stood perfectly ready at the master console, her fingers hovering over the glowing keyboard. It was finally time to show the entire financial sector exactly what kind of monster they were doing business with. Up in the elevated control booth, Maya slammed her hand down onto the master execution key. The 3 massive high-definition projection screens suspended behind the stage instantly roared to life. The blinding white light illuminated the dark ballroom, casting long, sharp shadows across the faces of the terrified elite guests. David physically flinched, shielding his eyes from the sudden, intense glare. He spun around to look at the screens, expecting to see his fraudulent merger documents. Instead, the Vanguard Financial corporate logo flashed briefly before dissolving into a pitch-black audio visualizer. The master speakers mounted around the perimeter of the ballroom emitted a low, heavy bass frequency that vibrated through the floorboards. Then the crisp, unmistakable sound of David's own voice echoed violently across the silent room. The audio was captured directly from the hidden synced microphone inside his expensive Tesla just 3 days prior. The audio quality was absolutely pristine. Every single syllable of his arrogance was broadcasted to the 500 people staring at the stage. I am telling you, Jessica, the money is already secured. His recorded voice bragged smoothly over the massive sound system. The senior partners are completely clueless. I have been quietly draining the private retirement portfolios of our top 50 clients for the last 6 months. It is over $20 million in liquid capital. We are going to use their own stolen money to finance the hostile takeover, and they will literally applaud me for doing it. A collective gasp of absolute horror erupted from the front row VIP tables. The senior managing partner, who had just introduced David, dropped his crystal champagne flute. The fragile glass shattered violently against the marble floor. He stared up at the stage, his face contorting into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. The wealthy investors sitting behind him immediately recognized the terrifying reality of what they were hearing. Their own financial advisor, managing partner, and trusted fiduciary was casually confessing to massive federal wire fraud and the theft of their personal life savings. "Turn it off!" David screamed, panicking. He lunged toward the acrylic podium, desperately mashing the buttons on his black remote control. "Turn the system off right now. Somebody cut the master power." But the remote control was completely useless. My master override script had permanently locked the entire hotel network. He was absolutely powerless to stop the digital slaughter. The audio recording continued to play loudly over his frantic screams. I forged my wife's signature on the Delaware shell companies. His recorded voice continued casually discussing his massive felonies. If the Securities and Exchange Commission ever notices the missing $20 million, they will follow the paper trail straight to Sarah. By the time they audit the firm, she will be legally declared incompetent and locked inside a state psychiatric ward. I am entirely untouchable. The sheer sociopathic cruelty of his confession sent a violent physical shockwave through the massive ballroom. The wives of the elite executives, who had just offered him their deepest sympathy, looked at me standing in the center aisle with profound, horrified realization. They finally understood the terrifying depth of his gaslighting. He had not just stolen their husband's money. He had systematically tortured, poisoned, and framed an innocent woman to cover his digital tracks. The black audio visualizer on the massive screens suddenly vanished. The digital guillotine moved swiftly to the second phase of the execution. The screens were instantly flooded with highly sensitive internal financial documents. I had programmed the system to display the undeniable digital paper trail. Massive spreadsheets illuminated the room, detailing the exact names of the defrauded investors, the date of the illegal transfers, and the exact dollar amount stolen from each individual portfolio. The routing numbers for the fraudulent offshore accounts flashed in bright crimson red letters. Total chaos absolutely erupted inside the grand ballroom. The polite silence of the corporate gala was instantly violently shattered. The wealthy investors were no longer sitting in their plush chairs. Dozens of furious men in expensive suits leaped to their feet, shouting aggressively toward the stage. They were frantically pulling their cell phones from their tuxedo pockets, desperately trying to log into their private banking portals to check their decimated retirement accounts. The room was consumed by the loud, frantic sounds of panicked dialing and furious screaming. The illusion of his brilliant financial empire was burning to the ground in real time. David was completely hyperventilating. He stumbled backward away from the podium, his hands gripping his perfectly styled hair in absolute disbelief. He looked like a trapped rat, darting his eyes around the locked room, searching for an impossible escape route. But the execution was not over. The financial ledgers faded from the screens, and the final phase of the digital slaughter began. The high-definition video feed from the hidden camera inside my living room smoke detector suddenly filled the massive displays. The video showed Jessica standing in my house wearing her expensive designer trench coat. Her face was projected 10 feet tall, looking incredibly arrogant and completely malicious. The crisp audio of her extortion echoed over the screaming crowd. "If you do not sign these papers right now, Sarah, things are going to get much, much worse for you," her recorded voice sneered. "Dr. Evans has already signed the involuntary psychiatric hold petition. They are going to drag you out of this house in a straitjacket. They are going to lock you inside a padded cell in the highest security wing of the state psychiatric hospital. You will never see the outside of a locked ward for the rest of your miserable life." The video clearly showed my frail, trembling body sobbing on the armchair, while Jessica proudly tossed the gold pen onto the forged quitclaim deed. It was the ultimate, undeniable proof of their joint criminal conspiracy. On the stage, Jessica let out a loud, piercing shriek of pure terror. She covered her face with her trembling hands, completely unable to look at her own giant image on the screens. The older wives in the audience began to shout at her, pointing their fingers and calling her absolute trash. She was no longer the arrogant new queen of the firm. She was a documented extortionist who had actively participated in the psychological torture of a sick woman. Her career, her reputation, and her freedom were entirely obliterated in front of 500 witnesses. She sank to her knees right on the brightly lit stage, sobbing hysterically into her hands. David was pushed entirely past the brink of rational thought. The sheer volume of the undeniable proof completely broke his mind. He realized that his entire life was over. He was facing decades in a federal penitentiary for massive financial fraud, embezzlement, extortion, and conspiracy. But instead of surrendering, his narcissistic arrogance forced him to make one final desperate, pathetic attack. He lunged forward and grabbed the microphone from the podium, gripping it so tightly his knuckles turned stark white. He pointed a shaking, angry finger directly at me, standing calmly at the bottom of the stage stairs. "Do not believe her!" he screamed into the microphone, his voice cracking with pure, desperate panic. "She's a manipulative liar. She is a senior forensic accountant. She set this entire thing up to frame me. Look at the financial documents on the screen. Look at the signatures on the Delaware shell companies. The corporations are registered entirely in her name. She is the sole proprietor. She stole your money and routed it to her own accounts. She is the one you need to arrest." He was actually trying to execute his failed backup plan right in front of the people he had just confessed to robbing. He was screaming that I was the criminal mastermind, desperately hoping the forged signatures would create just enough reasonable doubt to save his pathetic life. He was pointing the finger at me while the audio of him confessing to the forgery had just played less than 2 minutes ago. It was the desperate flailing of a completely defeated predator. The furious investors stopped screaming for a brief second, turning their heads to look at me. The entire room waited to see exactly how I would respond to his massive public accusation. I stood perfectly still in my razor-sharp black designer dress. I did not raise my voice. I did not act defensive. I did not show a single ounce of fear or intimidation. I looked up at the terrified, sweating man who had spent 5 years trying to slowly destroy my mind and my body. I looked at the man who had paid a corrupt doctor to murder my unborn children. I slowly raised my head and offered him a terrifying, ice-cold smile. It was the exact same arrogant, dead smirk he had given me in the lobby of his office just 3 days ago, when I caught him kissing his mistress. It was the smile of an apex predator who had completely cornered her prey and was finally ready to deliver the fatal blow. I did not break my terrifying smile. I simply raised my microphone again and let my voice cut right through his pathetic, flailing accusation. "You are absolutely right, David." I said, my words dripping with lethal precision. "Those 3 Delaware shell companies were entirely registered in my legal name. But you made one catastrophic mathematical error. You assumed I was too heavily medicated to notice the massive forgery." I raised my left hand and signaled the control booth one final time. Maya struck the keyboard. The giant screens behind the stage flickered, and the hidden camera footage was instantly replaced by a series of crisp official government documents bearing the heavy digital seal of the United States federal court system. "I want you to look very closely at the dates on those documents, David P." I instructed, pointing toward the massive projection. "Those are the finalized legal injunctions my corporate attorney filed exactly 48 hours ago. The moment I discovered your pathetic forgery, I legally reported the identity theft to the federal authorities. Those court orders officially declared your forged signatures entirely null and void. I completely severed my legal connection to your fraudulent corporations 2 days ago." David spun around to look at the screens. His eyes darted frantically across the complex legal text. His chest heaved as the horrifying reality of his situation began to physically crush his lungs. He was desperately trying to calculate what this meant for his stolen millions. Because I reported the fraud, I was legally authorized to secure the compromised assets. Yesterday morning, while you were downtown picking out your expensive tuxedo for this gala, I personally initiated a massive wire transfer. I systematically drained that $20 million out of your Delaware shell companies and routed it directly into an untouchable offshore trust in the Cayman Islands to hold it for federal investigators. You are completely broke, David. You have absolutely zero capital to fund your hostile takeover. You are holding 3 empty corporate shells that are currently actively flagging the Securities and Exchange Commission network with massive money laundering alerts. The ballroom erupted again. The sheer brilliant magnitude of the counterattack left the elite investors completely stunned. The senior partners of Vanguard Financial realized their stolen retirement funds were actually secured and waiting for federal redistribution. The rage they felt toward David was instantly replaced by a profound, terrifying respect for the woman standing at the bottom of the stage. I had outsmarted their managing partner at his own complex financial game without ever breaking a sweat. David dropped his microphone. It hit the wooden stage with a loud, painful crack. He stumbled backward, entirely stripped of his power, his money, and his arrogant pride. He looked down at his shaking hands, realizing he was holding absolutely nothing. The grand illusion of his empire had just evaporated into thin air. Then the piercing sound of heavy sirens bled through the thick acoustic walls of the hotel ballroom. The wailing grew louder and more aggressive, rapidly approaching the venue from multiple directions. Emergency lights flashed intensely through the arched windows, reflecting against the crystal chandeliers. Maya had timed the federal raid to absolute perfection. She had handed the complete encrypted hard drive containing the embezzlement records, the forgery evidence, and the medical extortion footage directly to her contacts at the Federal Bureau of Investigation earlier this afternoon. At the back of the ballroom, the heavy mahogany doors that Maya's security team had locked suddenly swung wide open. A massive tactical squad of heavily armed federal agents flooded into the venue wearing dark tactical gear and dark windbreakers with the bright yellow letters FBI printed across their backs. The elite crowd immediately parted, scrambling out of the way as the agents marched straight down the center aisle with absolute authority. "Federal agents, freeze!" A senior tactical officer shouted, his booming voice easily overpowering the chaotic murmurs of the crowd. The agents swarmed the main stage, completely surrounding David and Jessica. The moment the federal officers grabbed David's arms, the ultimate betrayal instantly ignited. The romantic partnership they had built on greed and cruelty violently collapsed under the threat of federal prison time. It was all her idea. David screamed frantically, thrashing against the heavy grip of the federal agents. He pointed a shaking finger directly at Jessica, completely throwing his young mistress straight under the bus. She was the one who manipulated me into stealing the money. She is the one who went to the house and threatened my wife with the psychiatric hold. I was just trying to protect my marriage. She orchestrated the entire thing. Jessica let out a shriek of pure rage, lunging toward David with her hands curling into violent claws. "You absolute lying coward!" she screamed hysterically, spit flying from her mouth. "You forged the signatures yourself. You paid the private doctor to drug her. You promised me we would be rich. You promised me the corner office. Tell them the truth, David. You ruined my entire life." They screamed and tore at each other like rabid animals trapped inside a sinking cage. The elegant corporate gala had officially devolved into a pathetic circus. The federal agents did not care about their desperate accusations. They slammed David down onto the acrylic podium, pinning his face against the clear plastic. They grabbed Jessica's wrists and violently twisted her arms behind her back. The sharp, heavy metallic click of steel handcuffs echoing over the massive ballroom speakers was the single most beautiful sound I had ever heard in my entire life. I stood perfectly still, watching the federal agents drag my husband and his mistress off the brightly lit stage. David was openly weeping, begging the senior partners for a lawyer as they hauled him roughly down the carpeted stairs. Jessica was violently sobbing, dragging her expensive heels across the polished floorboards, completely stripped of her arrogant dignity. They were paraded right past me in handcuffs, completely humiliated in front of the most powerful people in the city. As David was dragged past me, our eyes locked one final time. His eyes were wide with sheer absolute terror. He finally understood that the weak, sick housewife he had tried to bury was actually the architect of his total annihilation. I did not say a single word to him. I simply smoothed the fabric of my black silk dress and watched the federal agents march him out the massive wooden doors into the dark, freezing night. The execution was complete. The morning after the Vanguard Financial Corporate Gala, the entire financial district of Chicago was completely paralyzed by the massive scandal. The news of the federal raid dominated every single major media outlet across the country. David and Jessica were splashed across the front pages looking entirely pathetic as they were shoved into the back of armored federal vehicles. The incredibly arrogant managing partner who had spent 5 years meticulously planning my absolute destruction was currently sitting on a hard metal bench inside a freezing federal holding cell. His massive corporate empire had evaporated overnight. The Securities and Exchange Commission immediately froze every single account associated with his firm and launched a massive forensic audit. On Monday morning, David had his preliminary bail hearing at the federal courthouse. I sat in the back row of the gallery, wearing a sharp, tailored suit, sitting perfectly still next to Maya. David was led into the courtroom wearing a bright orange standard-issue jumpsuit. His wrists and ankles were bound by heavy metal chains that clinked loudly against the polished wooden floor. He looked incredibly hollowed out. His expensive haircut was entirely ruined, and his skin was a sickly shade of pale gray. His high-priced defense attorneys tried to argue that he was a respected member of the community and deserved to be released on house arrest pending trial. But the federal prosecutor, armed with the massive mountain of undeniable digital evidence Maya had provided, completely obliterated their arguments. The judge took one look at the forged power of attorney documents, the stolen $20 million, and the horrifying medical extortion footage. He immediately slammed his heavy wooden gavel down, declaring David a massive flight risk and an extreme danger to the public. Bail was completely denied. David physically collapsed against the defense table, openly sobbing as the armed bailiffs dragged him back down to the dark subterranean holding cells. He would not see the outside of a concrete prison wall for decades. Jessica suffered an equally brutal and entirely deserved fate. The very morning after the gala, the board of directors at Vanguard Financial officially terminated her employment. They did not even allow her to return to the executive floor to collect her personal belongings. She was escorted directly out of the building by armed security guards, while the remaining junior associates watched her walk out in total disgrace. Because her face and her cruel extortion threats were broadcasted to the most elite executives in the city, she was instantly and permanently blacklisted from the entire American financial sector. No reputable firm would ever even look at her resume again, but losing her career was the absolute least of her problems. The federal prosecutors aggressively indicted her on multiple felony charges, including accessory to massive wire fraud and criminal conspiracy to commit extortion. Because she was entirely broke and could not afford a high-powered defense team, she was assigned a heavily overworked public defender. She was currently sitting in a state holding facility, desperately trying to negotiate a plea deal by offering to testify against David, but the prosecutors already had all the digital evidence they needed. She was absolutely entirely useless to them. With their criminal fates completely sealed, I turned my absolute focus to the final severing of our marriage. When David and I first got married, he had insisted on an ironclad prenuptial agreement to protect his future corporate earnings. He thought it was his ultimate financial shield. But Maya was a brilliant corporate litigator, and she knew exactly how to dismantle a fraudulent contract. Under the laws of the state, any prenuptial agreement heavily funded by hidden embezzled money or tied to massive federal felonies is instantly rendered completely null and void. The moment the federal judge confirmed his indictment, the prenup burned to the ground. Maya and I drafted the most brutal and entirely unforgiving divorce settlement in the history of the county. I legally seized 100% of our shared marital assets. I took the massive suburban estate, the luxury vehicles, the extensive stock portfolios, and every single legitimate dollar sitting in our joint bank accounts. On Wednesday afternoon, I walked into the federal detention center to personally deliver the final blow. I sat down in the sterile visitor room separated from my soon-to-be ex-husband by a thick sheet of reinforced bulletproof glass. David was escorted to the chair on the other side. He looked at me with completely hollow, defeated eyes. He picked up the heavy black plastic telephone receiver. I picked up my receiver and listened to his shallow, ragged breathing. I slid the thick stack of finalized divorce papers through the narrow metal slot at the bottom of the glass partition. "You have absolutely nothing left, David," I said, my voice radiating cold, unadulterated power. "The house is mine. The accounts are mine. The prenuptial agreement is completely void because you are a documented federal criminal. Sign the papers right now, or Maya will drag this out in civil court until you cannot even afford to buy a candy bar from the prison commissary." David stared down at the documents. His hands were shaking so violently he could barely hold the pen his attorney had given him. He did not try to argue. He did not try to gaslight me or manufacture a new reality. The heavy sedatives he had used to break my spirit were entirely gone from my system, and my mind was incredibly sharp. He knew he had completely lost the war. He slowly pressed the pen to the paper and signed away the very last shred of his pathetic life. I took the signed documents, pulled them back through the metal slot, and stood up from the hard metal chair. I turned my back on him and walked out of the prison without looking back. 6 months after the federal raid, my life looks completely unrecognizable. I am standing by the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of my brand-new corner office overlooking the beautiful, bustling Chicago River, watching the boats glide peacefully across the shimmering water. The bright morning sunlight is pouring into the room, casting a warm, brilliant glow over everything. The heavy, suffocating brain fog that plagued me for years is entirely gone. My body has completely flushed out the toxic synthetic hormones David paid his corrupt doctor to pump into my veins. I wake up every single morning at dawn, completely energized and ready to take on the world. When I look in the mirror now, I do not see a pale, exhausted victim struggling to survive the day. I see a radiant, healthy, and incredibly powerful woman. My mind is razor sharp. My physical energy is absolutely boundless, and my heart is completely at peace. I reclaimed my health the exact same way I reclaimed my entire life, with absolute ruthless determination and unyielding focus. The massive settlement from the divorce gave me the perfect financial foundation to completely rebuild my career from the ground up. But I did not just reopen my old forensic accounting practice. I expanded it into a massive corporate investigative firm, and I brought in the most brilliant partner in the entire city. Maya left her old prestigious law firm and joined me as the co-founder and lead litigator of our new agency. We leased a massive, beautiful penthouse suite in the financial district right down the street from where David's firm used to be before the federal government seized the entire building. We are an absolutely terrifying and incredibly effective team operating with complete transparency and unmatched legal precision. I track the hidden offshore money and carefully dismantle the complex financial fraud, while Maya ruthlessly handles the federal litigation and destroys the corrupt executives in the courtroom. In just 6 short months, our business is absolutely booming beyond our wildest expectations. Elite clients from all over the eastern seaboard are desperately fighting to retain our exclusive services. We are completely booked out for the next 2 full years. We built a flawless reputation by taking down the exact same kind of arrogant, greedy, corporate predators that my ex-husband used to be. Walking into the boardroom every single morning and seeing Maya's brilliant, confident smile across the massive mahogany table is the greatest professional victory I could have ever asked for. We built our own invincible empire from the burned ashes of his destroyed kingdom. But the most profound healing did not happen in the courtroom or the executive boardroom. It happened quietly and steadily inside my own heart. For a long time, the memory of the fertility clinic was a deep, agonizing wound that refused to close. Discovering that David had actively paid a corrupt embryologist to destroy my viable embryos was a level of pure sociopathic evil that haunted my darkest nightmares. I spent several weeks actively grieving the children I was never allowed to meet. I mourned the intense physical and psychological torture I endured, believing my body was fundamentally broken and totally incapable of creating life. I cried for the years I spent blaming myself for his manufactured medical failures. But as the months passed and the toxic chemicals finally left my biological system, the paralyzing grief slowly transformed into a profound sense of liberating clarity. I realized that David did not break my inherent ability to be a loving mother. He actually gave me the greatest hidden gift of all. He completely severed any biological tie I would have ever shared with a deeply disturbed narcissistic monster. I am entirely free from his highly toxic bloodline. I will never have to look into the eyes of a growing child and worry that they inherited his cruel, predatory nature. He destroyed those embryos because he wanted to completely control me, but his malicious actions ultimately just set me totally free. I am finally pursuing motherhood on my own exact terms. I have officially begun the incredibly beautiful and highly rigorous process of private adoption. I am building a loving, peaceful, and fiercely protected family completely by myself, without the dangerous poison of a manipulative partner pulling the strings or dictating my choices. I have already converted the massive formal dining room of the suburban estate into a bright, beautiful nursery, filled with warm sunlight and soft, welcoming colors. I painted the walls a soothing, pale yellow and filled the shelves with classic storybooks. The dark, heavy furniture David bought to impress his snobby corporate friends is entirely gone, replaced by genuine warmth and absolute safety. The state social workers who visit my home for the evaluation interviews do not see a fragile, heavily medicated woman teetering on the edge of a nervous breakdown. They see a highly successful, deeply grounded, and incredibly strong mother who is fully prepared to give a child the most extraordinary, safe life imaginable, filled with unconditional love and endless opportunity. Every single piece of the life I have now is completely authentic, entirely mine, and beautifully peaceful. The money in my accounts is clean and fiercely earned. The vital relationships I have with Maya and my loving brother are fully restored and stronger than solid steel. We spend our weekends hosting massive family dinners in my beautiful home, laughing loudly until our stomachs hurt. I am no longer shrinking my remarkable intellect to make an arrogant, mediocre man feel incredibly tall. I am standing exactly at my full height. The massive storm that was supposed to completely drown me only taught me exactly how to walk on water and navigate the most treacherous oceans. I survived the absolute worst betrayal imaginable, and I came out the other side entirely unstoppable. I am the undisputed architect of my own gorgeous future. The throne is officially rebuilt, and the true queen is finally wearing her rightful crown. Exactly 1 year after the federal raid at the Vanguard Financial Corporate Gala, I took a long, quiet drive upstate. I drove my new luxury sedan, a car I purchased entirely with my own hard-earned money. I pulled into the bleak concrete parking lot of the United States Federal Penitentiary. The massive razor wire fences and towering guard towers cast long, cold shadows across the barren landscape. I parked my car and walked slowly through the heavy security checkpoints. I felt absolutely no fear. I wore a tailored, cream-colored trench coat and carried a simple leather briefcase. I was escorted by a stoic armed guard down a long, windowless concrete corridor to the maximum security visitation wing. The heavy steel door groaned as it opened, revealing a row of small, isolated booths partitioned by thick, reinforced, bulletproof glass. I sat down on a hard metal stool and placed my briefcase on the narrow ledge. A few minutes later, the metal door on the opposite side of the glass clanked loudly. 2 large federal guards marched my ex-husband into the tiny booth. The physical transformation of David was absolutely staggering. The arrogant, untouchable financial king, who used to wear custom-tailored silk suits and vintage Rolex watches, was completely gone. In his place was a frail, gaunt, and deeply broken man. His standard-issue bright orange jumpsuit hung loosely off his bony frame. His perfectly styled hair had thinned drastically and turned a sickly shade of dull gray. Deep, dark hollows circled his sunken eyes, betraying months of profound sleep deprivation and sheer terror. He shuffled toward the plastic chair, his wrists handcuffed tightly to a heavy metal chain wrapped securely around his waist. He sat down heavily and looked at me through the smudged glass. There was absolutely no anger left in his eyes. There was only a hollow, pathetic desperation. He slowly picked up the heavy black plastic telephone receiver with his trembling hands. I picked up the receiver on my side and held it to my ear. I listened to his shallow, uneven breathing for a long, silent moment. I opened my leather briefcase and pulled out a single sheet of thick legal paper. It was the finalized absolute divorce decree officially stamped by the federal judge. I slid the document through the narrow steel slot at the bottom of the glass partition. David looked down at the paper. He did not even read the text. He knew exactly what it was. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice cracking with a dry, pathetic rasp. "Please, Sarah, you have to help me." The public defender abandoned my appeal. "The other inmates know I used to be a wealthy corporate banker. They are extorting me for basic protection. I have absolutely nothing. My commissary account is completely empty. Please, can you just put $50 in my account so I can buy soap and extra food? I am starving in here, Sarah. I am begging you." He pressed his chained hands against the thick glass, openly weeping. The man who had callously paid a corrupt doctor to destroy my unborn children was now sobbing and begging me for pocket change to buy prison soap. I looked at him with absolute freezing indifference. I did not feel a single drop of pity. I leaned closer to the thick, bulletproof glass. "David," I said, my voice perfectly steady and completely devoid of emotion. "You spent 5 years trying to convince me I was losing my mind. You locked me in a psychological prison so you could steal my family legacy. You thought you were the smartest man in the world. But you need to understand one final truth before I walk away forever. Those Delaware shell companies you forged my signature on were completely empty before you even stepped onto that gala stage. The accounts never actually held my money. They only held your massive unchecked arrogance. I played you flawlessly. You built your own cage and you locked the door all by yourself." David stared at me, his sunken eyes widening in sheer horrified realization. His mouth opened, but no words came out. He finally understood the absolute totality of his defeat. I hung the heavy black receiver back onto the metal hook, instantly cutting off his pathetic sobs. I picked up my briefcase and stood up from the stool. I turned my back on the booth and walked confidently down the long concrete corridor. The heavy steel doors opened, granting me passage back into the free world. I stepped out of the dark prison facility and walked directly into the warm afternoon sunlight. The crisp autumn air filled my lungs with absolute freedom. I started my car and drove away from the massive concrete fortress without looking back. Women can sacrifice silently out of love, but we should never be mistaken for foolish. We might easily give up our careers, our time, and our bodies to build a family because we believe in deep loyalty and partnership. But the exact moment that loyalty is violently weaponized against us, the silent wife completely disappears. When you back us into a dark corner and try to steal our future, we will not just break the heavy lock on the door. We will completely burn your entire fraudulent kingdom to the ground, and we will stand victorious in the ashes. We are the brilliant architects of our very own survival. If you felt a massive rush of satisfaction watching this arrogant villain get exactly what he deserved today, please give this video a huge like and subscribe to the channel for more incredible stories of absolute justice. I want to hear from every single one of you. What would you have done if you found out your own husband was secretly draining your family trust fund and plotting your total destruction? Would you have played the long game like I did? Let me know your honest thoughts in the comments below.